Good morning, everybody, and can I welcome you to the 24th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2013. Can I remind all those present, I'll just wait for some of that noise to subside. Can I remind all those present that electronic devices, particularly mobile phones, should be switched off at all times. They do interfere with the sound system, and we'd rather that didn't happen. Our first item today is to continue evidence taking on the Children and Young People Scotland Bill, and the theme for our first panel of witnesses is kinship care. Can I welcome to the committee this morning May Barker from Clacks Kinship Care, Alison Gillis, Child Poverty Action Group Scotland, Kate Higgins from Children First, and Anne Swartz from Scottish Kinship Care Alliance. Good morning to you all. Before I move to questions from the rest of the committee, can I start with a kind of general question about the background, and perhaps you could all give brief answers, if you don't mind. We've got quite a lot on the agenda today, so we want to get through as much as possible. I wondered if you could all give us a kind of very short potted history of what's been happening over the last 10 years, since devolution effectively. What has changed for kinship carers over the last decade or so? Clearly it's been an issue which has come up a number of times in the Parliament and in society in general, and there have been a number of changes. So I just wonder, from the point of view of the organisations and the individuals, what has changed over the last 10 or so years? Can I just go along the panel? I'll begin with Anne.
Well, for the last 10 years, kinship care has been there for a long, long time. But particularly since 2007, there's been a lot of changes in terms of the legislation towards kinship care. And that was partly why the Alliance was formed, to look at those issues.
So, yeah, but what have those changes been?
The changes have been that in 2007 there was a policy in place that all children in kinship care would be treated equally with children in foster care. That was then changed in 2008 to only looked after children in kinship care would be provided for.
That's the only change? That's the only change you're aware of?
No. Can I pass this along to someone?
Okay, Kate.
Yeah, I think Anne's absolutely right to identify a big shift in 2007 in terms of kinship care being recognised in its own right as an appropriate arrangement for children who can't live at home with their parents. The movement towards that had begun previously when there have been a reference group set up to look at the needs of kinship carers and indeed foster carers together, but what emerged from that was that kinship carers had distinct needs. So in 2007, the government entered into the Concordat with local government, and one of the commitments it made was, as Anne pointed out, to pay an allowance for kinship carers, and that there would be a responsibility in local authorities to meet the needs of kinship carers. How that then was translated into action by local authorities is, again, as Anne says, that effectively the way to manage that was that it really only applied to families with children who were looked after. And that then, and again, when wanted to formalise, the government and Parliament wanted to formalise kinship care for the first time in legislation, all these things are about, well, what is it you can actually put into regulations? What can you put down in law? You need to have a mechanism that recognises which children we're talking about, and it used looked after status. And at the time, everybody supported that because those were the children with the greatest needs. And we needed to make sure that they were being assessed when being placed in kinship care, and that, some kind of rules, if you like, applied to how those children and families were being treated. But every action almost creates a reaction, and what we've discovered is that actually, while there's nearly 4,000 now children who are formerly looked after in kinship care, estimates suggest there's at least another 15 or 16,000 in informal kinship care, and that's probably a conservative estimate. And these are families that are either known to social work and local authorities, but whose children don't require looked after status, or quite often, you know, kinship carers would argue that they know of families who their children and families should be getting support, but simply in order to manage resources, it's not happening. Or else, quite often, a lot of those families keep themselves below the radar because they don't want the interference of, as they would see it, of local authorities interfering. So there's been a lot of change since 2007 and a lot of movement. And at this point, I think I'll probably pass on to Alison, because she can probably tell you a bit more about that. Some of what's changed has been about the financial side, and again, this whole action, reaction and consequences situation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Yeah, my area of expertise is in relation to the financial allowances, and particularly the sort of thorny issue of the interaction of the financial allowances with the UK benefit system. So, as we've heard already, there has been significant changes since, particularly since 2007, the Concordat Agreement. The initial agreement, which was to pay kinship carers of looked after children at an equivalent rate to foster carers, hasn't really become a reality. But what has happened is that all local authorities have shifted to a position where they are making payments of some sort to kinship carers of looked after children, and quite a number of local authorities are also making payments, again, of some sort, some level, to kinship carers of non-looked after children. But what we have, and maybe I can just focus on two issues here briefly. One is that we have a situation where there's huge variation across the 32 local authorities in terms of, if I just focus on the looked after children side of things at the moment, so huge variation in level of payment, from payments that are really very low, around about £50 a week, up to payments that are really equivalent to fostering allowances. So we have that, and at the same time we have variation in the legal power that local authorities are utilising to make payments. And you may think, well, what does that matter? But it matters in relation to the impact for those families on their ability to claim child-related or family-related welfare benefits. So I'll just say something very brief about that at the moment.
We will come back to this in some detail.
Yes, oh good. But suffice to say that it was obvious really from the outset, or ought to have been obvious from the outset, that there was a very complex interaction likely with the UK benefit system, and that's one of the reasons why it's so good that there's some forward planning going on at the moment in relation to any changes. So it really means that although local authorities have in many instances stepped up to the mark and made payments to kinship carers who've looked after children, the kinship carers are not necessarily gaining fully from the amount of payment that the local authority is making because of the interaction with the benefit system. And that results in a complex picture across the country in which some kinship carers, for example, at the extreme, would be unable to accept a payment from the local authority because it simply isn't worth their while doing so because of the loss. So there's no net gain at all. And just, I'll finish on this point for the moment. In other local authorities might be paying what looks like quite a considerable kinship care allowance, but the kinship carer's net gain is not the whole of that payment because of that interaction. So that's a development that has occurred in the last, well, particularly since 2007. That's probably enough from me.
Thank you.
Okay.
Me.
My area of expertise is I am a kinship carer, and learning everything the hard way down at the pit face as it is. I've only been involved in this since 2010. Like a lot more people out there, I didn't even know what kinship care was. It was a name I'd heard, but I never even thought any more about it. Clackmannanshire kinship carers became heavily involved because we got a sum of money and then it was cut. And we found that all councils were all paying different amounts, and we thought it should be, if, you know, for the same all over Scotland, and not at the discretion of whichever council happens to decide what they're going to do. I don't think I've got much more to...
Okay, we'll come on to some of these details as we go through the evidence this morning, but I just wanted a if just hang 1 second, Kate, I just wanted a general feel for what had changed over the years, because there's been a lot of work obviously in this area. Sorry, Kate.
Yeah, sorry, the one bit I should have said, a bit remiss of me really, is as well as the kind of legislative journey and the Concordat and what happened there, the Scottish Government also picked up on other recommendations that the reference group made and funded Mentor UK to work with kinship carers to produce a kind of guide to kinship care, which all of us disseminate to kinship carers and which is pretty useful. And also funded Children First to run a national service providing advice and support to kinship carers. And at the same time as well, the initial investment made in 2007 did see local authorities putting in place more support generally. I mean, there's a lot of inconsistency about how that was done and a lot of difference in how that was done. But generally, I think there was an increase in support available at local authority level, certainly in the first years. But we are seeing a lot of that being cut back. A good example is East Lothian, where they've had a really good set-up supporting kinship carers and have gone down to a part-time worker just in the last 12 months. And the final thing to say is all of this has helped support kinship carers to support themselves, in that there's an awful lot more groups, and some of them are quite informal and little loose groups, and some of them are quite formal, and that, I think, is also given rise, as Anne pointed out, to the formation of the Kinship Care Alliance. So there's peer support and there's formal supports available nationally and locally as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, no, I'm going to stop you there, sorry, May, because I want to get on to the questioning. I know that members are very keen to go through a lot of this detail, so rather than it just be an exchange between the panel and myself, I don't think that would be reasonable, and I'm sure that other members of the committee would object quite strongly. Liam, did you have a supplementary particular?
Yeah, I think following up what both Kate and Alison were explaining in terms of the kind of chronology of this. Obviously, with the Concordat, there was quite a wide basis of coverage, and that subsequently drilling down on where the need was greatest, those looked after and in kinship care were seen as the priority in a sense, and you can understand the reason for that. I suppose, though, is there any sort of light you can shed on why the Concordat was framed in the way that it was? Was the discussion about the resource implications of such a kind of open-ended commitment, or was there a kind of misunderstanding or perhaps an inadequate assessment of how wide this would have to be cast in order to honour that commitment?
I could just say very briefly, I might hand over to Kate after this, but I could be wrong, but my understanding of what was in the Concordat was the commitment to kinship carers of looked after children. I think that was the Concordat commitment. Possibly prior to that, there was a wider, well, there obviously was a wider discussion before that about where resources should be targeted. But I think by the time it got to the Concordat, other people might know better than me, I think the focus was on kinship carers of looked after children. And I think the logic behind that, although obviously this is looking from the outside in at what the logic might have been, but presumably it was related, as Kate already said, to the idea that that would be focusing support on children most in need of support. I mean, whether that is borne out in reality is another matter, but maybe you might have more to say about that. But my understanding is the Concordat focused on kinship carers of looked after children.
Yes, I think what has happened there is when the legislation was changed, and to to divide it to looked after children and non-looked after children in kinship care. I think that's where a lot of the problem came in. We had this formal and informal kinship care, but There is also two levels of the informal. You have the informal which are on residence orders, you have the informal who have got no orders whatsoever. And I think that is where things started to get muddied, where, you know, we have a looked after child and a non-looked after child, because all these children have comparative needs, whether they're in looked after status or not. And the way that the new bill is being written, that a lot of these children who are on the looked after status will be moved over to the non-looked after status, and their support will disappear even further. You know, and these are the issues that we need to look at.
I'm sure we'll go into much of this stuff as we go through, so I'm going to begin with Joan.
On the point that you made, Mrs Swartz, regarding the kinship care order, I know that in your submission and in your comments there just now you've raised some questions about the proposed kinship care order, but my understanding is that this isn't actually a new order, although that was the initial proposal. It's now an adaptation of the existing Section 11 order, and Section 11 orders last indefinitely, whereas in your submission it suggests that the kinship care order will only last 3 years, but a Section 11 order, which this effectively is, lasts indefinitely. I just wondered if you could care to respond to that.
Right. Yes, Section 11 lasts indefinitely. And the point we were raising about it lasting for 3.5 years is that the support will be there for 3.5 years. And at the end of that, that will cease to be there for the kinship children. The way that the new kinship care order is being written. And also that... Can
I just clarify that? I mean, that support you're talking about, just so we're clear about it, because
yes.
I don't want us to confuse all the different things here. But the support that's in place in terms of the specific point about the order is transitional support.
Yes, it's the transitional support, and we're of the understanding that at the end of the 3 years, when that transitional phase is through, what will be in place then? We get the impression there won't be anything in place because the way it has been written is that the looked after status will be getting further and further towards the non-looked after status. And at the end of 3 years, you'll have more children on the non-looked after status than on looked after. And their needs are comparable.
Just an observation in terms of your opening statements, that doesn't seem to be what you have described the direction of travel as in terms of policy towards kinship carers in Scotland. I mean, the description seems to be that the direction of travel, although there are problems, has been for more support for kinship carers since 2007. So I would be confused, I'd be surprised if it kind of suddenly went into reverse, which is what you seem to be describing.
I mean, that's the general sort of feeling that we have, is that's the direction it's going to go. Because there is so much disparity out there in local authorities. One local authority does one thing, another local authority does another. There's no consistency out there, and what needs to be done is consistency for this.
So what kind of consistency are you looking for? Do you think that kinship carers should have exactly the same support as foster carers?
Absolutely not. We are not foster carers, and we don't ever purport to be foster carers. We are kinship carers. The children are kinship children. But there are circumstances where both foster children and kinship children are on the same legal order. And if you go to foster carer, there's a higher level of support there. And the children that come to kinship care, their level of support is negligible in comparison in some authorities. And this is where we're seeing a lot of disparity and looking to rectify that.
But I think that someone made the observation in their opening statements that there are quite a number of kinship carers who would prefer not to have any involvement from the authorities. So if you're a kinship carer and you want financial support,
yes.
Can you reasonably ask for that without being assessed in the same way as someone who, maybe a foster carer who was getting that support?
No.
And that might not be what everyone wants.
I mean, not at the moment, there isn't. I mean, okay, it's not possibly what everyone wants, but it has to be written in such a way that it's open for you to do that, and you shouldn't have to jump through a lot of hoops with your local authority to get access to services that the children need. And in order to get the service, you need to have a looked after status, or it's very, very difficult to obtain.
Kate.
Yeah. Thank you, Convener. As the person who made those remarks, maybe just explain a wee bit more. Over the 2.5 years we've been running the National Service, and indeed for many, many years before that, Children First has always had a relationship with kinship care or family-based care in terms of supporting children who can't live at home. But we've done lots of engagement with kinship carers and their families, and we've shared most of that, I think, with the committee. I think there's maybe one piece on the financial review that we haven't shared with you then. I think in the most recent information, most kinship carers support the idea of a kinship care order. 60% of those who we surveyed engaged with said that was the case. The point about when we've explored with kinship carers their status and how they feel they're being supported, two things kind of emerged from that engagement that looked how we set up the regulations, how the government established the looked after regulations, almost created looked after status as a gateway to support and assistance. Now that's not helpful, because effectively what we're doing is encouraging more children to enter formal care settings, because looked after status obviously is state-based care, when actually the aspirations of most kinship carers are to get the support their children need to get a better start in life and to go on and have ordinary childhoods and to get the support they need to function as normal families. So aside from that, so looked after status doesn't help create that, because constantly you have the authorities engaged with you in your lives and in your children's lives. And we know of some instances where families have fought really hard, where it's quite clear that that child is no longer at risk of significant harm and therefore has no need to be continue to be looked after. Because the support goes with looked after status, some families have fought against it being removed. And that's not a healthy position for us to be in, that we have got children unnecessarily subject to state intervention in their lives unnecessarily. So the kinship care order is partially an attempt to provide support in a different way that doesn't create that artificial barrier. And the second thing, the second thing about it is just about kinship care being recognised in its own right as a legitimate arrangement for children who can no longer stay at home. It's always been a bit of looked after, kind of like foster care, one step into formal care but not quite. And recognising kinship care, as we all do, and I hope that we would, but it's certainly Children First's aspiration, that family-based care is absolutely legitimate and an appropriate way forward for children who can't live at home with their parents anymore, then we should be recognising it in its own right and making sure that the legislation we create around that covers as many bases as it can, so both formal and informal, enables people to move, for children to be moved from looked after into a more permanent setting, which is providing the stability that kinship care families want, but also enables those families that are currently sitting underneath the radar because they don't want people coming into their lives, they can themselves go and get a kinship care order through the courts and know that they've got stability and permanence in there in their children's lives. The other point about it as well is what we found is the additional support needs legislation and framework which should be working for all those children who are looked after and in kinship care, and indeed all those children who have what Anne said was comparable needs, in that they may have learning support needs, they are not getting the support they need through that framework. And if that framework was working more effectively, some of the issues that have come out of all our engagement about children not getting help and support, families not feeling properly supported, would actually go away, because education would be providing the support and using that legislative framework, rightly so, to support children's learning needs.
It seems to me, from what you've seen and what's been said previously about the confusion and the confusion and the lack of parity across the country, that the kinship care order might provide a clarity that has been lacking before.
Maybe I could come in quite briefly here. I mean, I think that it appears from the documents surrounding the bill that the direction of travel is away, or the desire is to shift away slightly from looked after status where it might not be absolutely necessary, which of course would be correct in the sense of least intervention principle. And for all that, I'm not going to reiterate what Kate has just said, but I think that the problem then that we're left with, if the objective, one of the objectives of the bill is to provide better support for kinship carers, which it is, I think that is an objective of the bill, then as things stand, it's a little bit difficult to see how that will work, because there is no clear message about what support will be available or will be attached to the new kinship care order. And I realise that this is a thorny issue, it's difficult, but it's also very difficult to find your way through and think, well, how is this going to be better? Is it going to be better than the existing situation without having some more clarity on that issue? And my fear, which I think is probably echoed by other organisations and individuals, is that we may end up with a situation which, by and large, replicates the situation that we've got at the moment, in the sense of the huge disparity between treatment of kinship carers in different local authorities across Scotland, because it would appear that there's certainly, at the moment, there's no indication that there'll be any obligation on local authorities to, for example, I mean, I'm very focused on the issue of financial support, which I realise is not the be-all and end-all, but it's just my area. So there's certainly no indication that there would be any obligation on local authorities to provide a minimum level of financial support. And I think, given that that is the situation we have at the moment in relation to looked after children in kinship care, i.e. there's a commitment but no legal obligation and no minimum level of payment, then we can see what has happened. We can see that across the country there's huge variation in the treatment of kinship carers of looked after children. And so it's difficult to see how that is not going to be replicated unless there's some shift. And that would be quite a major concern in terms of the equality issue across Scotland between kinship carers and different local authorities.
So I understand what you're saying, that it is patchy at the moment and you're concerned that it could remain patchy. My understanding is, though, that there is more in Scotland than there is south of the border.
Well, my understanding, and not that I'm an expert in the situation south of the border, but I have looked at it in some detail. Sorry, I just leapt in there. Is that okay? No, that's fine. The situation south of the border is this is my understanding, that if you are a kinship carer of a looked after child south of the border, you're assessed as a foster carer, just because of the legal differences in Scotland and as opposed to England and I assume Wales. And because of quite hard-fought cases, case law has established that those people in the English and Welsh situation will be paid a fostering allowance equivalent to that paid to an unrelated foster carer. So the position of kinship carers of looked after children in south of the border, as far as my understanding goes, is actually better. It's more clear-cut. And that's... So if we're comparing those two groups, then I think that's the situation. And then the difficulty, I think, from research that I've read in the English and Welsh context, is kinship carers of non-looked after children, for example, people with residence orders, a special guardians order, which doesn't exist in Scotland. They are the kinship carers who are struggling in that context, because the local authorities have a discretion about whether to pay what's called a residence order, special guardians, a residence allowance or special guardians allowance. So I think that there are lessons to be learnt from that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Liam.
Just to follow on, I think following on from what you've been saying, Alison, about some of the uncertainty, is that a reflection of what isn't actually in the bill but will come through regulation? I mean, obviously there are, you can't have a bill that is laden down with every kind of I dotted and T crossed. But is some of the concern that you're alluding to there a reflection of issues that may be better dealt with and clarified in the bill rather than awaiting sort of detailed?
I mean, I think my concern is, I mean, there's lots of concerns, and this is, I'm very, as I say, very focused on this particular issue of finance. My concern is whether in secondary legislation local authorities will have some legal obligation, be given some legal obligation to financially support kinship carers who have a kinship care order. The indications from what we've got at the moment, I mean, I would be surprised if that's the intention, but you know, I guess it's possible. But my concern relates to that particular issue about you know, if local authorities are not legally obliged, then it's likely to there's likely to be a postcode lottery. Is the
presumably? I mean, that in a sense you don't need to detail what that might be, but it would be helpful if indeed the policy intent was clearer in the bill. Is that?
I think in relation to trying to work out how things might look and what the implications might be, and whether in fact what's proposed is likely to be better than what we've got at the moment, then I think a bit more detail would be helpful. Yeah.
Okay. Kate, sorry, were you?
If you can be very brief, we've got a lot of questions.
Right, just very briefly, on the points that you were raising, I really don't think that you can compare, you know, English and Welsh services to Scottish services, because it's entirely different, and I've looked into that quite a lot, and they struggle as much as we do up here with the inconsistencies. And I think what we need to look at is yes, there will, in the new kinship care order, it will be left to the discretion of the local authority, the way it's written, as to what supports are going to be available, whether you can access a kinship care order or not, and also the legal side of obtaining the kinship care order will be left to the individual to get. There's, you know, to pay for, you know, there's a lot of inconsistencies throughout.
Sorry to interrupt again, this is very confusing, but my understanding is that if somebody gets the kinship care order, or a Section 11 order, amended Section 11 order, they are then, we move from a situation where it is, in terms of local authority support, it is discretion, but we move to a situation where if they've got that, you would be required to provide some kind of support. You said the opposite there.
Yes, I said the opposite because I've asked to have that point clarified, in that if somebody who's on residence order just now, will they be automatically granted a kinship care order? Will they get the access to the supports? Because not all Section 11 residence orders do get anything at all. They get nothing at all. So if they get the new kinship care order, will they obtain the support that's going with it? Or will they have to be assessed, and how will they be assessed to get that?
My understanding is a requirement, so I'm still slightly confused. But Kate, did you want to, I'm bringing Neil in 1 second, but Kate.
Yeah, just very briefly, trying to pick up on both points. One of the things that is not clear yet, and it will come out in secondary legislation, and I suppose the only assurance really to give is that the Scottish Government is engaging with all the organisations and kinship carers themselves and what that should look like. One of the things to highlight that has been suggested is this idea of a start-up grant. Now, that came about because of what kinship carers told us, that one of the things that they find really difficult is finding the support and clothes and things for children when they arrive in their families. And I think that's just a sign that everybody's listening to that, and that's one example of support that they'd be expected to get. But there are concerns because we know how things get interpreted by local authorities. We've seen the huge disparity in terms of the local allowance, and there would be concerns about there being a bit of picking their way through, you know, the menu, if you like, of supports, and therefore creating another layer of inconsistency for families, and that's just what everybody wants to try and avoid. The other quick point I would make is just that it's not just through the kinship care order. Section 62 in the counselling services, which I think a lot of discussion and debate around whether about the appropriateness of the name of that and whether or not that describes what the intention is of that provision. But that provision has come into the bill entirely based out of what kinship carers have told us about and what the government has found about the need to have a mechanism that enables early intervention when a placement, particularly kinship care placement, is at risk of breaking down. And we would just make a plea. We know that there is some concern from the local authority side and professional side about where this has come from and what it's intended to do and the resource implication, but we make a huge plea to keep this in. Maybe not here in the bill, maybe not call counselling services, but this is absolutely vital to furthering the idea of an early intervention, that we get involved in families where a child is at risk and instead of waiting for a crisis point to be reached.
Thanks, Convener. The kinship care orders, it's been mentioned that we have a £500 start-up grant and some transitional support for 3 years. Yeah, but as we've heard this morning, some councils give weekly amounts to kinship carers on an ongoing basis. Presumably this support is there because kinship carers need that support in order to keep their children on an ongoing basis. So my question is, you know, without this weekly ongoing support, would kinship carers be able to look after their children? And if transitional payments were to end after 3 years, is it not the case that the kinship carer would not be beneficial for some kinship carers?
It's not just the financial side of, you know, the support. Sometimes you find that, I mean, and in the researches I've done, that there can be stability for 2, 3, 4 years with a child. And then, for whatever reason, it destabilises. Now, if you're not on any sort of legal order or under social work support, access to services for these children to get back in through the new kinship care order, it says you can come back in, you know, and obtain support whatever length of time down the road for these children, but that is going to be left to the discretion of the local authorities as to whether you can get back in or not. You know, so we need to look at the wording of that.
Sorry, I'm sorry for my confusion here, but how would it work if it was automatic? I mean, surely it has to be discretionary. I can't see how it would be an automatic right. So somebody surely has to be assessed at that stage. You can't have a system surely where those who might be in receipt of this just decide that they get it.
No, what I'm saying is that local authority, the discretion for assessment of the children will be at local authority level. Now, at the moment, that is as it is just now, and it's causing a lot of difficulties throughout a lot of local authorities. So therefore, we need to look at tightening that up in some way. I don't know how, but we have to do that.
I mean, as a kinship carer, the question you asked, I definitely could not manage without having some form of, because I'm on a pension, a state pension, and as a teenage girl I've got, so I just wouldn't have the money to be able to look after and bring her up the way the other children are, so she can join in and be the same as everybody else, and that's what we're looking for. It's not just money as well, because you need to be able to get psychological services. We had to, you know, have psychological services and I think also that respite is something that we're wanting to see. Respite for the child or respite for the adult, whichever. If one goes, the other one gets respite, you know. But, you know, I'd have been glad at the beginning, especially when we were fighting head to head, toe to toe, you know, just for a weekend without, you know, it's quieting down a bit now, but no, at the beginning it wasn't. So she didn't like getting some rules, you know, and there has to be rules, and she didn't have any. So I would have been glad to sort of, even an afternoon away would have been. So there's not just money involved in it, but yes, I couldn't have managed without having some form of finance help.
Okay. Very briefly, Kate, 'cause I don't want to
Just,
move on.
I think it would be helpful to seek clarity from the Scottish Government on this. Our understanding is that the allowance that goes with the kinship care order is temporary up to the transitional support for 3 years, but that will not stop those children who are still looked after receiving a kinship care allowance through the looked after regulations, nor indeed would it prevent local authorities continuing, as most of them do, and it's not been the most helpful thing that they've done, to continue to make payments and supports through Section 50 and Section 22 of the 90, Section 59, the 75 Act, and Section 22 of the 95 Act. And just to say the other thing, one of the things we found overwhelmingly is that kinship carers themselves think there shouldn't be any difference paid between that every kinship carer family should get an allowance, both formal and informal, and that they should all get the same amount, and they prefer to see a national allowance. And I think it's quite unfortunate that the financial review hasn't caught up quickly enough to allow us to address some of those issues in the bill and kind of put them to rest, you know, for once, and try and take that forward, because it's almost the elephant in the room, in that it gets in the way of everything else, and it is inequitous that you've got inequitable that you've got local authorities paying different amounts, and that's not what kinship carers want, and they recognise themselves they want everybody to receive the same amount, and we should listen to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Claire.
Thank you, Convener. I think a lot of the points in this section have already been covered, but I would like to ask, particularly Kate mentioned about the additional support needs framework not working as best as it should, and obviously GIRFEC is key to actually what's happening in the Children and Young Persons Bill. Do you think the passing of that bill and the implementation of GIRFEC will address some of those problems?
I'd like to think so, and I think that's one of the points about, I think one of the key things is about how are people going to get access to the kinship care order and indeed the support allowance, and it's if you're a qualifying person in the bill, and also if the child is eligible, and we would advocate that an eligible child is a child within the definition of well-being in the bill, to put all children on a level playing field, because that's the direction of travel in terms of when services, if you like, kick in support of children. So it's where a child's well-being and using the Shanari indicators might be being compromised or needs to be promoted or invested in, and that would enable GIRFEC to apply. I think there are wider issues about the relationship between GIRFEC and additional support needs and how both frameworks come together, and I'm not sure they have been fully resolved. I know, and you might hear this from Highland Council, but where councils are doing GIRFEC very well, they've got over that, and I think we should try and learn from that and put that into practice. But what May said about the kind of support that she would have welcomed in her family, and is there in evidence, Anne had the same issues, and is there in evidence about what families are looking for in terms of engagement. It is help from health, it is help from schools. We did a session on additional support needs as part of our regional forums in 2011, and the number of kinship carers, they had never heard of this before, that they had the right to go to their local school and ask for their child's learning support needs to be assessed, and that, you know, that the authorities through education rather than through social work should be providing support for their children. And so it's not working at the moment. GIRFEC should help. It does help where it's being done well in the country, and it is an aspiration, but we need to make that work better for families and kinship care families in particular.
Thank you. Liz Smith.
Could I turn attention to the situation when a child moves from looked after kinship care to non-looked after situation? The Kinship Care Alliance, Mrs Swartz, has said very clearly that the support should last for longer than the 3 years if it is to encourage permanence and respond to the needs of the child. That's in your evidence. Could you provide us with the clear-cut evidence as to why you think that that should be extended? Where is the evidence that would help this committee to understand why it should be beyond 3 years?
It is quite difficult to get clear-cut evidence, but on speaking to the members of the Kinship Care Alliance, it has become quite clear, like I said earlier, that there are cases where, you know, that has to remain in place because there is instability. You've got a lot of these children have comparable needs to children that go into foster care. They have fetal alcohol syndrome. They have, you know, withdrawal from drugs. They have all the issues and more when, you know, as children that go into foster care, because ultimately these children would have gone into foster care at great cost to this government. And it's not all about money. We need to have access for these children. And in order to obtain that access, you'd need to have a looked after status. Otherwise, it's extremely difficult at local level to get that. And that's why we want to see it continue throughout the child's life.
So are you saying that there is more urgency about financial support beyond that 3 years, or more about the support from a psychological or a social basis?
I think they're both equal. You know, because a lot of the kinship carers have had to give up their employment because there's such inconsistency in local authorities. They have used all of their savings and been told to go to Department of Work and Pensions when their savings run out, even although the children are on the official looked after register.
Yes. Could I just ask Mrs Gillis, on the points you made, obviously your expertise is very much in this financial area. As a committee, we're wanting to get to grips with the facts that prove the case that all four of you actually have stated this morning, that we've not quite got this right. Yeah. Could you give us some idea of where the best factual statistical evidence is to prove the case that you're making?
Well, I mean, in terms of... I can refer you to some research which I referred to in my written evidence, which is research called Kinship Care Fostering Effective Family and Friends Placements, which is Farmer and Moyers in 2008. It's referenced in my written evidence. Now, that indicated, I don't think this is going to be very surprising, that indicated that financial security and some enhanced financial support improve the stability of kinship care arrangements and the eventual outcomes for children. I think there's a dearth of longitudinal studies in this area and comparative studies. However, the indications from, for example, that research are, I say this, it's not surprising, that increasing the financial support in addition to other supports, but just focusing on that, does overall increase the likelihood of kinship care arrangements succeeding for the child. And I think that, so I would point you to that, and the other aspects of kinship care situations, because, I mean, I guess this is a question that we've all asked ourselves. Why is it that kinship care arrangements are different? Why do kinship carers, I mean, a lot of this information has already been stated today, but why are they different? Why do they need extra support, if you want to put it as bluntly as that? And I think there are a number of reasons. There's the fact that, statistically speaking, kinship carers are likely to be poorer than general population and also official foster carers. And also, they're likely to be caring for children at a time in their lives when they weren't expecting to be caring for children. They're probably a lot of kinship carers. I mean, I'm not the expert in this area, but I'll just state this briefly. A lot of kinship carers will have had to give up employment, or they will not be at a stage in their lives when they're able to contemplate employment in order to boost their income. So for all of those reasons, and in addition to that, the particular needs of at least a good proportion of the children who are in kinship care arrangements, so the particular needs of those children and their experiences are likely to mean that additional support, both financial and otherwise, is necessary. So that particular piece of research, I think, is interesting and useful in pointing us in that direction.
You obviously rightly flagged up the fact that lots of different local authorities have very different rates, and I think you mentioned 17, and that means 15 are obviously not doing very much at all. Is it clear-cut in your mind that those authorities that are paying higher rates, that the outcomes are very much better? I mean, is there a general satisfaction that the higher rates are providing us with a better outcome?
Could I just come in here on a point? I think what the difficulty is, we could bash this around and bash it around, but at the end of the day, there's been a lot of, nobody knows the true figure of kinship care. No one at all really knows what the figures are. And in the financial memorandum for this, there was a lot of figures bandied around. There's this amount of kinship carers, so it'll cost X amount of money. There has been, as far as I'm aware, no research done into the number of kinship carers. And I think this is what happened as well in 2007. It was announced that children in kinship care would get between 119 to 198 pounds per week. Now, as someone has said earlier, nobody was aware. A lot of people were aware they weren't a kinship carer. Kinship carer is what they were doing. I am one of those. I was not aware what I was doing was called kinship care. I was raising, and still am, 3 of my grandchildren. Now, they were on looked after status, but the local authority chose to ignore that. There's, and it's not just myself, there's hundreds of people out there in that position. And I think if we don't get this right this time, you will get hundreds, thousands of more kinship carers coming out, like happened in 2007. And again, the finance will not be there behind this, which is a pity that the two haven't been put together.
But with respect, one of the things we've got to take a decision on, and obviously the Scottish Government has to make a decision when it comes to the financial memorandum, is how much money is actually going to be made available to address this issue. Now, to make that sensible, we need to ensure that there is evidence behind that money somewhere, that we can prove that to spend that amount of money, we're making things better. And what I'm trying to drive at is, where would you like to steer the committee that we have as best possible knowledge of that evidence that creates an informed opinion?
Could I also refer you, in a slightly promoting of CPAG way, to the, we have a recent report called the Cost of a Child in 2013. I could even leave that so you've got the reference, etc. So that, I mean, that obviously doesn't relate specifically to kinship care, but it does relate to the costs of bringing up a child. And I mean, I'm sure this is information that you'll have at your disposal anyway. But it might be useful in the background to those thoughts.
Okay. Do you want to go in briefly here?
Briefly, echoing what Alison's just said there, there is a dearth of longitudinal research on the outcomes for children in kinship care, but actually the evidence is what we know. If it's good enough for our own children to grow up in family-based care and that gives them the best chance of a better start in life, then it's good enough for kinship care children in terms of family-based care. And there's also what we know about the outcomes for children who grow up in residential care. As a committee, you've done an inquiry into educational attainment and looked after children. And one of the findings you made was about there's not been so much progress for those children looked after at home. Now, part of that's about where the resources have been invested. And, that, you know, it's two sides of the same coin. You've got families here telling you they're not getting enough support. We know from our engagement that the ESN framework's not working well for them. You've also found low educate, you know, not a significant improvement for looked after children. You know, there's your chain, effectively, in terms of one of the impacts of poverty. Another one is, as you said, about the inquiry about taking children into care, about acting early enough. Now, those children are compromised from a poor start in life in their earliest years and the impacts of poverty. There's loads of evidence around the impacts of poverty on children. And if all we are doing as a state is saying, is taking children out of one deprived situation in a range of ways, not just income related, and placing them into another care arrangement where we say, well, actually, you're still not getting any more money. We know what's going to happen there, that actually we're not being fair to those children and giving them a best start in life, and we know the consequences of that. And I would just say, briefly as well, we're increasingly hearing from local authorities about the cost of kinship care and how it's becoming unaffordable. And this is back to the whole thing about preventative spending. We know that the cost of kinship care placements are tiny compared to the cost of residential care placements and even foster care ones. And we have to start getting local authorities to recognise the value. We know it's tough times and budgets are constrained, but, you know, kinship care arrangements save all of us a lot of money in the long term. They shouldn't be done in the cheap, and those children have the same rights as other children to grow up not in poverty.
Very much.
Thank you very much. We're rapidly running out of time, and there's a number of issues we still have to address, but I want to just clarify this from the policy memorandum, because I got the impression when you were speaking, Anne, earlier about the transitional arrangements, that effectively it was 3 years and finish.
Yes, that was our understanding.
The policy memorandum, so that's what I thought you'd said. So I just want to quote from the policy memorandum. It says, at page 29, paragraph 122 for members, secondary legislation may specify that an authority must explain to a carer what support will be provided before they commit to an order and for how long. It then goes on to say, as the intention of the kinship care order is to promote strong families, the assumption would be that support would last no longer than 3 years in most circumstances. That doesn't sound like an automatic cut-off. Would you agree?
That it would last no longer than 3 years in most circumstances. So that would say to me that it would, you know, at the end of 3 years, in the majority of circumstances, it would cease to function.
Yes, but it says most circumstances, so it's not automatic. And
No, it's not automatic. But
well, that's the question I asked you.
Yes.
And secondly, the sentence before that says that the local authority must explain what support will be provided before they commit to an order and for how long. So clearly the information must be available before that process is agreed upon.
yes, but in the majority of kinship circumstances, you get the knock at the door at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. If you don't take these children, they go to foster care.
Sorry,
So,
no, we're talking
you
about,
know,
sorry, Anne, we're talking about transitional arrangements here. We're not talking about that
Right,
2,
okay.
3 in the morning stuff. Do you agree that it's not the cliff face that you seem to be describing earlier?
How much of a duty will be placed upon the local authority for them to do that, though?
I'm sorry, well,
How, you know,
the policy memorandum
That's my
seems to be
concern.
different from what you were saying. I just wanted to clarify the point about, because it is an important point,
Yes,
about whether it's
okay.
a absolute in terms of 3 years or it's not an absolute. That's a very two different circumstances, and I think we have to be clear about this. It's a very complicated issue and a very important issue, and we all need clarity. I think, as Liz was saying earlier, about exactly what's happening here. So I'm very keen for us to move on, though. I'll have Colin next. Colin.
The panel's been very clear in highlighting the fact that there's considerable discrepancy between the different local authorities in terms of what sort of support is given to kinship carers. Can I ask the panel, do you think the bill itself will do anything to improve that consistency.
Hold on a second, Colin, because whoever's got their phone on, please switch it off. Sorry, Colin.
Yeah. Can I ask, does the panel think that the bill itself will do anything to improve that consistency in terms of the 32 local councils?
Shall I? I mean, not as it stands. So I think as it stands, the implication is that, I may be wrong about this, but the implication is that what will follow in terms of secondary legislation will give local authorities the ability, I think the implication is it will give an obligation, but not specifying levels of support. I think my understanding from what we've got available at the moment is that in all likelihood there'll be a great deal of discretion at local authority level. I mean, that's my understanding in terms of what we've got at the moment. And given what has happened to date with the current system in relation to approved kinship carers, where local authorities have committed to assisting approved kinship carers, but obviously there's a huge discretion at a local level in terms of how that will be delivered in the level. So given what we know about how that has panned out over the past 5 years, then my fear would be that a similar pattern might develop in terms of the differences between local authorities. What I would say, this might not go to your question precisely, but I'll just say it now. Hopefully it's some useful information, that one thing that will be assisted by, if we're comparing current situation to proposed kinship care order, in relation to the interaction with the benefit system, really the heart of that issue at the moment is the looked after status of the child. That's really, that in conjunction with payment from the local authority in relation to accommodation and or maintenance, is the problematic issue in relation to benefits and tax credits at the moment. And that's what leads a number of kinship carers of looked after children into the situation where they're not able to claim those family related benefits, or some of them. And so it leads to a great deal of complication and confusion at the moment. If the new kinship care order comes into being and therefore people with that order, the children don't have looked after status, then a lot of that complexity in relation to the interaction with the benefit system will disappear. So that's a positive, I guess, but what remains is, well, what do local authorities do with that new power, for example? You know, so we might still have a huge variation between local authorities, but we're unlikely to have the same complexity in terms of interaction with the benefit system. However, my final point on that issue is that for kinship carers of looked after children, which obviously will still be quite a large group of people, all that complexity will still exist, and actually is likely to become even more problematic with the advent of universal credit. Well, that's probably enough about that at the moment.
Can I ask the panel, the government's undertaking a review of kinship care allowances, which is expected to finish towards the end of this year. What would the panel's expectation of that review be?
I think, just to repeat what said earlier, that what kinship carers have told us their aspirations is for a national allowance that every kinship care family receives, whether no matter their status, and it's paid at the same amount. They want kind of equity and parity across all their families. I think that wouldn't prevent local authorities looking at the particular needs. And I think, you know, to go back to your previous question as well, what would create greater consistency in approach is if, to pick up on Claire's point as well, that if GIRFEC is more, if there's greater alignment with GIRFEC and you get a more child-centred approach that's more around the needs of individual children, you'll get a consistency of approach. What that means is that you'll get everything being an individualised package from the menu, but it'll be much more consistent in how it's assessed and how it's applied. So in terms of an allowance, that would be one aspiration. Another thing that we would like to see, and there's potential to do it in this bill, is one of the things we uncovered from kinship carers is a number of local authorities that pay a kinship care allowance and then deduct the value of child benefit from it. Yeah. So that actually families don't get the full value of their allowance, and they're also being means tested on, well, until very recent times, what was one of the few remaining universal benefits. And we would like to see that kind of behaviour being prevented by legislation, because it's not fair. And we don't do it to any other families. We don't, you know, we don't do it to families, for example, that qualify for free school meals or a clothing grant voucher. So why do it only to kinship care families? And if we could remove those kind of options and anomalies, it would help.
Can I maybe just briefly mention about the Clerks Kinship Care petition? Do you think that, given the provisions of the bill and hopefully the progress that's being made, are Clerks Kinship Care reconsidering the need for that petition?
I don't think we can reconsider it until it's come to fruition, can we? I mean, that's something we'll have to discuss. You know, we put it forward and it's still going through, so until such times as we, you know, we've seen it come to fruition, we can't take that decision.
So, assuming that the bill goes through, it would certainly influence your decision as to whether to press the petition. I'm just curious on this.
Yeah, well, I can only speak for me because I'm the only one you're asking, and until I go back and put it to the committee, I couldn't give you an honest answer. But we would consider it, that's all I can say.
Thank you.
George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to ask about the benefit system. I know we've already gone on. Alison nearly kind of answered every question I've got to do in the first 5 minutes. But I'm going to ask them anyway.
There's a lot more I could say about it.
Good.
Unfortunately.
But I agree that obviously Anne and May mentioned it's not just about money, it's about support as well. But as a constituency MSP, I constantly get families like May and Anne coming to me, and it's a financial minefield going through the benefit system for a kinship carer. So say if we're looking at a situation, obviously it's Westminster based, the benefit system, so say if we're looking at day one and we're starting in a fresh sheet of paper, and any other cliches I can fling in there at this stage, but what would be the best way forward if you were doing that for kinship carers in Scotland?
Kinship carers of looked after children?
Yes. Well, in general, how would it make it easier?
Okay. Well, I need to divide the two, because the two are, I mean, we have the UK benefit system that we've got. So let's just, are we assuming that's still there in your,
for the time being?
Okay, in your day one scenario. So if we still have that, then and if you accept. There's a lot of ifs and buts in this, but if you accept that kinship carers of looked after children need and ought to get some additional financial support from the local authority, if we all accept that for the moment anyway, then a way of doing it would be for the local authority to make that additional payment in a way that is not, that means the payment is not for accommodation or maintenance. And that does circumvent some of the difficulties that exist, because just by way of a very small explanation, the rules that are problematic to kinship carers that are within the benefit system at the moment are rules, this is my opinion, but they're rules, I think, that are intended primarily to prevent, for example, a child in foster care or in a residential unit, a child who is, in the ordinary sense, looked after and accommodated by the local authority, to prevent a child in that situation from anybody getting benefits for that child. So it's all about double funding. So kinship carers, unfortunately, are caught by those rules in certain circumstances. A way for kinship carers not to be caught by those rules is for additional financial support from the local authority to be for needs that are additional to accommodation and maintenance. So that's just a way around it. It's not a fundamental solution to the problem, because a fundamental solution to the problem would lie elsewhere in relation to the benefits system at the moment. For kinship carers of non-looked after children, in relation to the benefits system, there really are not such huge difficulties. The complexities for those kinship carers, again, this is just my understanding and anecdotally, mainly relate to issues such as delays in getting benefits sorted out, problems where there's competing claims for benefits because maybe say the parent of the child is still receiving child benefit, child tax credit. So there are more administrative difficulties rather than a fundamental issue of not being entitled. So for kinship carers of non-looked after children, even where they are receiving some kind of allowance from the local authority, as some are at the moment, the difficulties in relation to the benefits system are not so great and are more easily circumvented, if you like. Circumvented is not the right word, but they're more easily overcome. The sort of remaining issue, which a lot of people focused on at the outset of, including me, at the outset of the Concordat when we were thinking about this whole issue, was the treatment of a payment from local authority in the sense of whether it counts as income or not in respect of means-tested benefits. But that is not really an issue anymore at all. The payments that are available to local authorities to make to kinship carers, either from Section 50 of the 1975 Act or Section 22 of the 1995 Act, or Regulation 33 of the Looked After Children Scotland regulations, all of those payments are disregarded as income in relation to means-tested benefits and tax credits. So that's not really the issue. The issue is that for some kinship carers of looked after children, the very fact of the looked after status and combined with a payment that relates to accommodation or maintenance, those two facts come together to disentitle entirely the kinship carer from particularly child tax credit, which is obviously a significant source of income if you're on a low income. Did that help at all?
Yes, anyone else?
Sorry, what was your question again? Just rethink the whole benefit system.
Yes, if the benefit to kinship carers, if you had the opportunity, how would you make the benefit system work if it was day one you start for kinship carers?
I think, sorry, I'm just going to leave back in here, but at the moment the answer is that the payment is not for accommodation or maintenance. That's the answer. The problem, I would just add though, is that under universal credit, which is slightly receding into the distance at the moment, but under universal credit, as things stand, the universal credit regulations are going to be very problematic because currently what they say is that you will not get universal credit for a child if the child is looked after by the local authority, and there are some exceptions to that. For example, if you're looked after but living with your parents, somebody who has parental responsibilities for you. But as I understand it, from my reading of the universal credit regulations as they currently stand, a kinship carer of a looked after child would not be able to get the child element of universal credit, and that is regardless of any payment from the local authority. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the local authority is paying nothing. That rule is still going to impact. So that's something that we are certainly hoping might shift before universal credit actually comes into being for most people.
Where I was trying to come from was possibly the idea of, if it's the Children and Young People's Bills coming from the Scottish Government, would it not, since we've said since the kinship carers in 2007, there's been a change in Scotland in the definition that kinship carers are accepted, would it not be an argument that possibly if we had the more powers within the Parliament of welfare, we would have the opportunity to actually make the difference for the individuals here as well?
The proposed kinship care order is directing that the majority of kinship carers will end up within the Department of Work and Pensions for to support these children. And again, I'm going to reiterate about the comparable needs of these children to foster children. Foster carers are not directed towards the Department of Work and Pensions to provide and support for these children. So therefore, why should kinship families be directed in that direction? And the new kinship order, as I say, is directing it towards the majority will end up, receiving benefits from the Department of Work and Pensions. Now, don't want to get too political, but say that you do have a yes, you do become an independent. Scotland becomes independent. Would you then expect the UK government to support financially and otherwise Scottish children? I don't think that's the right way to do this.
I don't think that would be the case.
I think we know that would be the case. They're two separate countries. I mean, so I don't quite see how that fits. I think we're kind of going off on a tangent here, to be frank.
Yeah, I know. I was being a bit.
Let's get back on. Well, it wasn't civilly your fault, Anne. But let's get back.
I couldn't resist. I'm sorry.
No,
I couldn't.
Let's stick to the bill in question. Kate, very briefly, for other people want to come in.
Which actually focus on the here and now. As part of the financial review, the engagement we did with kinship carers, we were surprised to find how few were actually receiving benefits they should already be entitled to. And there's something about income maximisation when people become kinship carers and making sure that they are able to access everything they're entitled to. We tried to do some of that before the bedroom tax came in, particularly with council tax benefit and housing benefit, in terms of promoting that to members and to local authorities. The second thing would be, we wrongly assumed, like everybody else, as is evident though, however, by both me and Anne, but we wrongly assumed that because an awful lot are grandparents, ergo they are pensioners, and that absolutely underscored that they're not pensioners, they are actually of working age, because they're very youthful and not necessarily of pensionable age. And I suppose we need to be alert to the impacts then of welfare reform. We were successful by all working together in getting the bedroom tax to some degree, getting kinship carers exempted from that. The second thing would be, and we've raised this at Welfare Reform Committee, that because we have taken on some of the powers and some of them have been passed on to Scotland, there's an opportunity to look at whether or not things like passported benefits work for all the groups that they should do. Free school meals, clothing grants, access to leisure, these are all things that kinship carers have told us they would benefit from. It would help them out, it would give additional support and income, and we would encourage Welfare Reform Committee and the government to look, when it's having to make new rules for some of these benefits, whether or not kinship carers can benefit.
Okay, I've a very brief question, a very brief response. Claire Adamson.
Complete clarity here. From what's been said, my understanding is that for non-looked after children, there isn't a problem with DWP at the moment, and that at the moment, universal credit aside,
yes,
looked after children, it's working practice of the local authority that can solve this.
I mean, I was. Yeah, but I mean, I don't want to open this whole thing up again. But I mean, frankly, it seems to me that just by reclassifying some of the way that things are paid will not in itself solve the problem. I mean, that was some of the discussion of the bedroom tax.
I mean, I can
we had
say
exactly the same problem.
Yeah, I mean, let me just. I mean, you're right in the sense of the situation for kinship carers of non-looked after children. There really isn't any particular complex, difficult rules within the benefit system that impact on those people. The issues are more administrative and yeah, so that's correct. The other issue is much trickier, and all I would say about it, just finally and hopefully briefly, is that what the rules that exist within the benefit system currently do is say, if you have a combination, in effect, of a looked after child plus a payment from the local authority, which is in respect of accommodation and or maintenance, then that is a problem. That's what then follows from that in terms of what local authorities might do or not do, I think is probably beyond what I would want to comment on, but that is a situation with the benefit system.
So do all local authorities pay in that way? Have some changed their practice?
Well, what I am able to tell you about the way local authorities pay is that probably the majority pay under a power, Section 50 of the 1975, Children Act 1975, which is specifically in relation to maintenance. So by definition, the payment is for maintenance because that's what Section 50 says it's for. Only 2 or 3 use a power under Regulation 33 of the Looked After Children Scotland regulations. That's, again, my understanding at the moment. And that really does have very particular problems in relation to the benefit system. And then some local authorities, maybe a group of about 6 or 7, I think, use Section 22 powers. Yeah. So Section 22 of the Children Scotland Act. And that power, as you're probably aware, is a very broad power. And therefore, the payment under that power can be for a number of different things. So that's the current situation, as I understand it.
I'm going to bring Neil in here, but I've got to clarify this. You know, if it's the case that all local, after what you've just said, if all local authorities who are paying under the difficult areas, under Section 50 and 22, if that was the case...
Regulation 33.
Sorry, 33, I apologise, 33, yeah. Yes. If they then suddenly shifted to the one that's less difficult, then wouldn't DWP just spot it and deal with it in the way that they do?
I mean, the question would be, it's not the name of the... Obviously, if you pay under Section 50, then it is by definition for maintenance. That's what it says it's for. So that's... I understand your point. If you pay under Section 22, then if you just say it's for something else, is it accepted that it's for something else? You would probably have to ask somebody else that question. But it is the case that some local authorities at the moment are making payments under Section 22 and specifically categorising those payments as not for accommodation or maintenance, for additional needs, separate from that.
Okay,
that's the situation.
Thank you for that. Neil?
In terms of the transitional support for those that have achieved a kinship care order that's been modelled at £70 a week, what benefits, if somebody achieved a kinship care order, would they be automatically entitled to, in your opinion? And would it be, it also states that support will only be provided, this is in the financial memorandum, support will only be provided if it's not automatically provided elsewhere through universal services in Scotland or across the UK, including through the UK benefit system. Is it conceivable that the whole £70 would be paid by the UK benefit system? £70 per
Well, certainly I can answer in terms of the amount of money. I mean, I don't know what the intention is in terms of the payment by local authorities in addition. But if you were somebody who had little or no other income, so for example, somebody who was dependent on state benefits, then the amount of money that you would get in relation to a child ordinarily would be around about £83 per week, and that's a combination of child benefit, which is £20.30 for the oldest child, and child tax credit. And that amount could rise by up to another around about £80 if the child, for example, had a severe disability. But ordinarily, the amount of money that was specifically related to the child via child benefit and child tax credit would amount to around £83 a week. And if the local authority were to make a payment in addition to that, then providing that would say, this is under the new system, proposed system, if a payment was made by the local authority in addition to that, then if it was using a power that currently exists, for example, Section 50, already mentioned, or Section 22, then that would be disregarded as income. Well, child benefits not means tested anyway, but by child tax credit. So I think your other question, which is really about whether the local authority would therefore not make the payment, is one that I can't answer. No.
Okay. Liam MacArthur.
Moving on to counselling.
Yes.
I think there's probably more one for Kate specifically. You were talking earlier on about it appeared a potential threat that the counselling aspects of the bill might be lost. I mean, certainly we've heard no evidence to that effect. But what's clear is that there appears to be inconsistencies in terms of the framing of the bill, which talks about counselling, but a policy memorandum that extends to family group counselling, family mediation. It seems to be a broader definition. In terms of eligibility, again, this is within the bill left to regulation in due course, although the policy and the financial memoranda talk about it linked to kinship carers. I think the policy memo says counselling can be used to promote the role of a kinship carer. Is there anything in terms of the wording of the bill that might be improved in terms of getting a better consistency in terms of the language and what's understood by what's meant in these provisions?
Yeah. I think it centres around the word counselling, because our understanding is that counselling has quite a specific kind of practice connotation and definition. I think the aspirations of the provision are absolutely legitimate, and the reason why it's been identified as desirable, particularly in relation to kinship care, is what Anne alluded to, which is quite often it being very last-minute placements where a child can simply no longer, it's not safe for that child to stay in their family any longer, and regularly do phone people up almost out of the blue to say, can you take this child tonight? And our experience of being one of the standard bearers of activities like Family Group Conference is that when you bring families together to plan for when a child is at risk of going into care, they tend to reach family-based settlements, and they also tend to reach sustainable settlements. And we are doing some research in this area to look at the kind of longer-term outcomes from that. So some of it is motivated by that. However, it is about the early intervention. It is about the kind of supports that either enable a child to go into sustainable, non-formal care setting, or prevent a child from moving into that care setting. So we would be looking for wording around something like early intervention or family support services. And I think what is key, will be key, is what comes through in the secondary legislation. My understanding is that the Scottish Government's highlighted two in the memorandum: family group conferencing and family mediation, but it wouldn't prevent, for example, parent programmes, anything that would help help kinship carers and others who are providing, foster carers perhaps, or others who are providing informal care, or indeed to stay with their parents, moving that step forward into the care.
I mean, given what you say about the precise definition around counselling, but also what you say about the understanding of what will come through in terms of secondary legislation, I mean, are you comfortable, therefore, with the way in which the bill's phrased sitting alongside the policy memorandum, or are there things that we should be looking to perhaps firm up through this process that may help in terms of the secondary legislation process?
Well, two things we would like to see is for it to be changed from counselling services to another name. Now, everybody's got a different viewpoint on what that should be, but we'd be happy to go away. We all talk to each other in the voluntary sector, and there are discussions, and there have been discussions about this, and we'd be happy to come forward with some options that we think would better describe what the intention is. What is there in the actual section is actually okay, apart from just the reference to counselling services, because we think that that does or gives effect to the intention legitimately. The other thing we would suggest, and that would be quite helpful, is to move it from where it sits in the bill to actually being part of the GIRFIT parts, because it should be seen as relating to that, because effectively what they're talking about is early intervention and almost enshrining in law a duty to act early rather than wait until a child is moving into care, and it absolutely fits with the GIRFIC intentions, and it would give greater clarity, I think, as to why that clause has been included in the bill if we moved it into those parts rather than where it's sitting at the moment.
In terms of the eligibility, I mean, we're looking at costs, I think, in the financial memorandum between sort of £2 and £6 million, which potentially could be spread quite thinly. I mean, are there things that we should be pursuing with the Scottish Government in terms of its intentions there, but whether or not this is broadened out beyond kinship care, or are there specific priorities as far as you're concerned about where that sort of conferencing, that mediation can deliver the most effective results?
The most obvious starting point would be where kinship care is being considered, and it would encourage local authorities to plan more effectively for those arrangements, and that in itself is a support to kinship carers, rather than kind of being landed with something that they weren't expecting, so that everybody's got time to be involved in that. And crucially to that is the child-centred approach, so that the child or the young person, where they're able to express a view, is able to give their views on what should happen. So I think we would argue that it should be, the starting point for it should be kinship care, but the provision should be worded in such a way not to prevent it being used in other circumstances. One of the ways in which, for example, family group conferences have been used successfully has been in arranging safe contact, where there's been a breakdown in contact and residence between parents, to actually, you know, similarly in the way that family mediation works, where there's been a breakdown in contact, for example, with grandparents. So it can be used in a variety of ways to get families round the table and encourage them to take responsibility for decisions about what is in the best interests of children. So yes, kinship care should be the starting point, but it should be worded in such a way, and we'll go back and have a look at that and maybe recommend that to the government, that doesn't prevent other uses. We've given some costings on what we know the cost of family group conferences are, and how to do them. So we think that that estimate is fairly accurate insofar as it applies to kinship care.
Can I thank the panel of witnesses this morning very much for that evidence. We spent a lot more time than we'd originally scheduled for it, but I think it's a very important part of the bill, also a very complicated and complex issue and area, so I hope you don't mind that we took extra time this morning on it. Can I just raise something with members? Given the difficulty we had in trying to get some clarity around some of the questions, I think it might be at this stage, I'm just going to throw this out there, that we write to the Scottish Government now and ask a number of the questions, so we try and provide clarity around these questions before we get the Minister in for questioning, rather than go through the whole scenario again. Members agreed to that? We'll do that then. Okay, thank you very much. I'll suspend briefly while we change panels. Can I welcome to the committee this morning Bill Alexander, Director of Health and Social Care with Highland Council. Highland Council was, of course, the national pathfinder for the implementation of Getting It Right for Every Child, and the experience of the Council are obviously very relevant to our scrutiny of the bill. I want to move straight into questions, if you don't mind, Bill. I'm going to start with Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much, Kabir. Good morning. Obviously, the experience of Highland is going to be, I think, very helpful in terms of our understanding of potential implications of the bill and where we need to be looking to refine it. In terms of the decrease in the number of referrals to the Children's Reporter, on the face of that looks obviously a positive indicator, but I understand that the number of hearings, number of proofs, child protection orders, etc. hasn't decreased, and that would tend to suggest that the potential financial savings that are realised through the application of GIRFIC and the way that you've done it perhaps haven't necessarily been particularly significant. Is that a fair reflection of the experience?
Okay, good morning, Mr. MacArthur. Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to be here. Issue of financial savings is complex. And I suppose the bottom line is that we have not had a policy of taking financial savings out of children's services because of the implementation of Getting It Right for Every Child. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have done. But what we have done is reinvested that money in early intervention and further preventative services. For example, the caseloads of social workers are significantly reduced. We could have reduced the number of social workers we've got. We haven't done that. We've invested in frontline workers that can undertake preventative work. We're about to invest in additional health visitors. And we believe that by doing that, it not only makes good professional sense because it means better outcomes for children and family, it's actually in terms of financial savings, the long game. Because we're already seeing child protection registrations down, we're seeing numbers of looked after children down, and there will be savings as a consequence of less children with higher level needs.
But the reduction in child protection registrations, looking at the figures I've got in front of me, suggest that in 2007 the numbers were 125, and while in 2012, sorry, they stand at 111. So a small reduction. Actually, in 2008 they were down to 60. 2009 they were 69 before they kind of nudged back up towards three figures again. Is there any detail around why that pattern perhaps has been evident?
Our numbers were generally 100 to 150 over the years preceding GIRFIC. Post-GIRFIC implementation, they've been between 75, 80 and 100. They dropped to quite a low number. There really is nothing precise, I have to say, about how many children you have on the register, because a lot of children might be a good thing, a few children might be a good thing. When it bounces around, I think that asks questions about your services. It sometimes bounces around in Highland because of inward migration or because of large families or other particular issues that are relevant to Highland. But what I would say is that the drop that we had around the time of GIRFIC implementation was about confidence in the system. And that really is the key issue, not the number of children on the register, but confidence in the system. There are hundreds and thousands of people who work around children's services, and there are hundreds and thousands of people who can press a red button in terms of child protection concerns. And if someone presses a red button in terms of child protection concerns, you'd be pretty foolish to ignore it. You take it very seriously and you err on the side of caution. And if that means you apply a child protection registration label, you do that. Now, clearly, in the long run, that isn't sensible, because you couldn't have every single child in your authority on the child protection register. It would be nonsense. You have to focus in on those children who you actually believe are at greatest risk of significant harm. And if the numbers come down, it suggests that there's more confidence in the system that you're getting that right. And I think that's what we've achieved.
In terms of the resources, you talked about a move towards additional health visitors in due course. I suppose one of the questions around a pilot area is the question as to whether or not additional resources have been put in order to trial particular approaches, etc. Is the experience in Highland one where you have had to put in those additional resources because of what you're planning to do, and therefore does that, I suppose, teach us anything about how the kind of wider rollout nationwide might apply? Because resources has come up in relation to specific aspects, and obviously the experience of Highland is pretty crucial in understanding how that might play out.
Yeah, I think this is a critical issue. There are two sets of issues around resources, aren't there? The resources in the system that you need to sustain the model, and the resources you need for change, to support a very complex process of change. Are you wanting to ask me about both of those?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Firstly, in terms of the process of change, as Mr. Maxwell said, we were the Scottish Pathfinder. There was some other Pathfinder activity around some domestic abuse pilots associated with the introduction of new multi-agency case conferencing. But the Highland approach was whole system. So it was police, it was social care, it was education, it was health, it was third sector, it was families. And the Scottish Government funded professionals in all of those areas. So we had a teacher, we had a representative of the third sector, we had a social worker, we had a health visitor, to look at what the implementation of GIRFEC meant for all of those professions, because integrated working isn't about some big homogenous blob. It's about the joins between the different professional groups. So we had to get it right for each of the professional groups. And each of those professionals, apart from some people that we seconded into the Scottish Government over the period, each of those professionals was located within Highland, and the Scottish Government funded those. That developed the components of getting it right for every child. It developed the national guidance and developed training material that other authorities could use. It also allowed us to network with a range of authorities up and down the country, and we did roadshows, we did all sorts of events. Over the period from 2006-07, the Scottish Government invested in those posts between £150,000 to £200,000 a year. I think over the whole duration up until 2010, it was about £640,000. But that was for the National Pathfinder. Now, I often get asked, how much of that would each new authority need to replicate? Well, a lot of it you don't, because a lot of the basic work was done. But you do have to go through some of the processes, because Inverness isn't Glasgow or isn't Dundee or isn't Angus. And you do have to look at it in your own circumstances and in your own context. But you don't need to work out, I mean, when getting it right started, when we got the list of components from the Scottish Government, named person didn't feature. It wasn't on the it wasn't on the list. That developed through practice experience. That developed through discussions with families and with professionals. Now, other people don't need to do that work. We've done that work, but you still need to do some. Critically, you'd need an implementation plan, you need a training model, and you need to develop new guidance that reflected your own practice. Having said that, you already have a training program, you already have to produce guidance in terms of whatever practice model you have. So some of those costs are costs that you would currently have. But yes, there would be some additional funding to support that change, and my understanding is that's why that's being made available.
Through the Pathfinder process, finally, obviously the implementation of GIRFEC, as I understand it, wasn't kind of finalised until around 2010. But some of the earlier improvements in terms of child protection registrations were being ascribed to that process prior to it being kind of fully bedded in. What kind of level of confidence do you have in making the link between the embedding of GIRFEC and the delivery of some of those outcomes?
I think improvements of outcomes take time. And even now it's fairly premature. I think we're starting to see green shoots, and we're seeing various process changes. I think we're also seeing some outcome changes in terms of number of children who use alcohol, number of children who self-report using drugs or smoking, number of exclusions from school, etc., etc. I think some of those will take time. We had a very helpful evaluation undertaken by the University of Edinburgh, which saw us through the implementation process. Now, we had 3 different implementation plans. I'm happy to talk about that. First 2 weren't effective. The third one was. The third one started in the city of Inverness, so it was a contained area, and it started with newborns. So we started assessing using the assessment framework, named person, child's plan, with newborns. We then extended that to early years. We then extended that into the school age. We then extended that to children who were already with high-level needs in the system. So we had a manageable group that we could look at that was different to the rest of the Highlands. So, for example, the University of Edinburgh evaluation focused very much on children within Inverness. And they could look at that because we began to implement Inverness in 2008.
So in terms of the final point I was going to ask was about the outcomes for care leavers. I mean, some of those look like they're much the same as they were in 2008, but presumably your argument to that is that those would fall into probably the final group you mentioned, and actually this is about a longer-term strategy, or a strategy to deliver longer-term objectives.
I think so. If you look at our looked after children numbers, they were going up at the same rate as most of the rest of the country until about 18 to 20 months ago. The first group that started to come down significantly were children who were looked after at home. And I have to say that initially that worried me, because I thought, no, that's early intervention. That shouldn't be going down. And I had a lot of arguments with colleagues and practitioners and the children's hearing system about why that was happening. And they convinced me that it was happening because the children's hearing system was confident that a plan was in place, that there was a partnership with the family, and we didn't require compulsory measures. And therefore, it was sensible that that was where it was impacting first. It impacted next on children who were accommodated. That's because children who are accommodated are already at the top of the system. They've already got high-level needs, and you can't turn that around overnight. That is now starting to drop, and very significantly, and that's different to much of the rest of Scotland. It still hasn't impacted in terms of the number of children that we have in specialist placements out with the authority. I think that will take longer to impact. And I think those are all early signs of it working as we continue to see the numbers coming down. So the numbers of children that we have who are on supervision at home will shortly, I think, be under 100, which for an authority the size of Highland that used to have 600 looked after children is astonishing. The number of persistent young offenders we've got, the number of offence referrals is dropping dramatically. We have about a third fewer offence referrals every year, and it's continuing to drop at that rate. And I don't know how long that will drop, because at some point I believe it will plateau, but that's the sort of rate it's dropping at just now.
Thank you.
Can I just, one supplementary from myself, Bill, the drop in those who are accommodated, those children who are accommodated, where do they go? How are they now classified?
Well, I mean, there's three things happening there, aren't there? Firstly, some children are moving into permanence more quickly. That might be through kinship care arrangements, as you've just been discussing. Secondly, some children are returning home more successfully. And one of the things that my colleagues tell me, and this is very relevant in relation to the report you published this week, is that when children become accommodated in Highland, they need to be accommodated and they do not bounce back and forward. So we're not having that effect that you've identified in your report that is appalling, that has happened in Scotland for many years where children bounce back and forward. And secondly, fewer numbers are needing to become accommodated for the first time. Now, you can't turn around all those three streams overnight, but those three streams are now being turned around. So fewer children being accommodated than were being accommodated, more children moving into permanence, and more children returning home successfully.
That sounds pretty good, given the, as you say, the committee's report that we published yesterday.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
I mean, I'm not coming here to tell you about an untested product. I'm telling you to tell you about our practice model. We're not perfect, and we don't get everything right, and we still make mistakes. We're not complacent, and we are also working to try and make sense of what's happening while we also do the day job. And frankly, and this might sound a bit selfish, we're more interested in doing the day job than we are in explaining it and evaluating it and making sense of it for everyone else. But everyone in Highland passionately believes that it works and that it makes more sense. And as I said in my contribution to you, I don't get complaints from people about it working. I only get complaints now about it not working. But we're not complacent.
No, I'm sure you're not complacent, but obviously we're very keen to understand, one, that if it is working, and secondly, why it's working. But you said that children are returning home successfully. Where's the evidence for that? Where's the evidence that the children are not just going back to the same circumstances or similar circumstances they were in before, which is the evidence from other parts of the country, certainly, that we've received during our inquiry.
We don't have children yo-yoing in and out of care, as you identified in your report. We are much clearer that when children become accommodated, it is because that is the appropriate step to take, and other things either are not available or there's a good reason that we should not do that. That might be, still might be that we've attempted certain interventions and they've not been successful, and therefore someone becomes accommodated, but it's much clearer, people are much firmer, and just like our social work caseloads now are much firmer, and social workers aren't wrestling with a whole range of cases, some of whom frankly used to be inappropriate, social workers are able to concentrate on that critical work with the most vulnerable.
Thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Mr Alexander, I'd like to ask you about it's a sort of an anomalous situation where you've been piloting GIRFEC when it's not actually going to be in statute until the bill goes through. And I'd like to ask you specifically about information sharing and whether Highland experienced any difficulties using the current legislation to share information, and whether, given your experience, whether you feel that section 26 and 27 in the bill on information sharing are required.
Okay, I've watched the webcast and I've seen some of the detailed discussion of particular terminology, and I'll perhaps not get into that. I'll try and answer your question from a practitioner base. As I understand it, what is proposed in the legislation is what the Information Commissioner's Office regards as best practice, and I would suggest it is what we currently do. And as a practitioner, I would want perhaps to emphasise 2 points. Firstly, people have always both shared information and had concerns about sharing information. And in the old days, that led to both information not being shared when it should be, but also either a scattergun approach, because when people thought they should pass something on, they were totally unclear about who they should pass it on to, and it was very often passed on to not only every agency, but also within each agency, a range of different people. I have to tell you that when I started in my post as a head of children's service 12 years ago, I would get an email every day about someone who had a concern about a child. And that's totally inappropriate. It's reflecting a blockage in the system, and someone doesn't know where to go, and therefore they've sprayed the gun so wide, they're even spraying it to senior managers who don't know the first thing about that particular situation. So that's entirely inappropriate. The alternative, and the other thing that would happen, would be referrals to the children's hearing system. So someone had a concern, and actually they thought this is what they should do. This is how we thought you should proceed. If you had a concern, you made a referral to the children's hearing system. So that would go off, be posted away. It would sit in the due respect to the children's reporter, in the children's reporter's inbox for a few days, perhaps even a couple of weeks. They'd get around to looking at it. They'd probably consider, if there might be some merit in it, they should ask for reports. They'd write a letter to a range of different agencies. They may be appropriate ones or not. And in the process of asking for the report, someone who should have that information might work out that there's a concern there and might dig a bit further. Now, that's how we used to share information. We now do it directly through named persons and lead professionals, and the lead professional issue is very relevant, and if there's an opportunity to talk about that, I'd like to. And I would suggest that we have actually done it as is proposed in the new legislation. Why then does it need to be in legislation? Well, it's not happening elsewhere, is it? Because GIRFEC was published in 2006, it works, it's evaluated, here we are in 2013, and children in Scotland are still not safe and having their well-being protected because it isn't a fundamental entitlement that those children and those families can expect in Scotland. So if the only way to get it done so that all children get that entitlement is to put it into legislation, then even though we've done it without legislation, I accept that we do need the legislation.
Can I ask if the pilot was able to look at the area of well-being concern as well as child protection in terms of your implementation at this stage? And have you any insight on that to give us?
I mean, in terms of, we don't use the word threshold in Highland, but I guess you're using you mean the word threshold.
It's obviously the bill brings in the idea of well-being
Yeah.
as well as child protection.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested to know if well-being was included in your training
Yeah.
for information sharing.
The word, I mean, the word child protection is a word we pay great respect to, but it suggests this awful black line that you're either on this side of or you're on that side of. That's not the real world. You know, a child isn't on one side or other of that black line. They live in families, they live in communities, and they have a range of circumstances. They have a range of protective factors, and they have a range of risk factors. And you've got to look at that whole picture. And if you only wait until someone you believe is on the cusp of crossing that black line, then it's going to be very difficult to address some of those risk factors in their lives. Now, having said that, you don't share information unless you need to. And unless it is about significant harm, you should never share information without the consent of the family and, depending on the age, the child or the young person. But there has to be a point in it. You know, you don't go around rushing around sharing information just for the sake of sharing information. Mostly, you'll share information because with the agreement of the family, and often at the request of the family, you are seeking support or help or advice from another agency. And that's why you do it. Occasionally, you do it because you need to take very radical measures to protect a child. And when you do that, you don't stop to ask consent. You have to take that serious action. So the whole process of sharing information has to be built into, firstly, why are we doing this? And secondly, it has to be built into the consent model that you're doing it in partnership with the family, unless there is risk of significant harm.
Liz Smith.
Alexander, one of the reasons that many people think Highland has been so successful is because you have ensured that your different departments across the local authority work pretty seamlessly, and that you have actually had a very good culture within the local authority, and that's maybe one of the reasons you haven't required legislation. Do you think that some of the reasons for the other local authorities not performing so well is because they haven't had that same culture?
You want me to stay friends with my colleagues up and down the country? It's a very good question, Mrs. Smith. I mean, firstly, I think you're absolutely right. You can't untangle the implementation of a practice model from the relationships between services, from leadership in different services, from how practitioners on the front line already get on and collaborate. And therefore, getting back to an earlier question in terms of outcomes, I think that there are a number of factors there. It's not just about the practice model, but the practice model is the frontline delivery of a joined-up service. And it isn't just about the culture in leadership of agencies. It's also about people getting together on the front line. You know, if you work in a deprived community in Highland, or if you work on a remote island in Highland, you're used to getting together and collaborating and getting on with it. Why hasn't it happened elsewhere across Scotland? Well, it's difficult, isn't it? And firstly, it does require a level of political bottle, and that's what you've called for in your report this week. You've called for leadership from government, and it did require political bottle from NHS Highland and Highland Council in particular to go down this road, because it's easy to go in every day and do things the way they've always been done and cross your fingers and hope things will be all right. It's very difficult to develop a new practice model. We did have that political support. I would also suggest that Northern Constabulary were a very major player, and we had firstly a very effective relationship with the Chief Constables of Northern Constabulary, who also had the bottle and passionately believed in improving outcomes for children and families. And we also have both a very active third sector, and we have good engagement with children and families. So we had a number of things in our favour. Now, that might not exist everywhere else, and it's not for me to sit and analyse what the situation might be in other parts of Scotland. But certainly we did have all those factors in our favour.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Colin.
Thank you. Previously, this committee has taken evidence in relation to the Single Child's Plan and concerns around that, given the sheer volume of assessments, plans and so on that are in place, and how that brings them together, and how successful it's been in the Highlands bringing it together would be really of great interest. Have there been difficulties in achieving that? Has it been relatively easy? And where do the other plans sit in relation to that central plan?
Well, there aren't other plans. There's only one plan. But it's a really great question. I came into this work in 1980. I started work in a children's unit in Glasgow, a busy children's unit in Glasgow. And I didn't understand why it was that the more complex a child's life, the more plans they had. You could have a looked after plan, and if they're on the child protection register, you had a child protection plan, and if they had a disability, you often had a respite plan, you had an education plan, and you had a health plan, at least. And the more complicated your life was, the different number of plans. But more than that, there were different processes around those plans. So you'd meet with look at a looked after child plan this week, and you might meet next week and look at the child protection plan. And it might be a different group of people who are meeting, some of whom didn't know what was decided the previous week. And see about running something that's complicated. I tell you what, that was very difficult to manage and very difficult to run. Now, what we had to do is change all of that. We had to move away from that. And we talk about the single plan. The critical bit is actually the single process, because there were half a dozen different processes there. The education review, the health review, the learning disability review, the looked after review, the child protection review. And we had to consolidate all of those processes into a single process. Now, we've got a plan, and that's the plan. That's the format for it. We spent a lot of time getting the plan. It wasn't easy, but we got a version 1, and we ran it for a year, and we decided after the year we wanted to modify it and reduce its size, and that's version 2, which went live about 6 months ago. What was much more difficult was stopping the processes. I remember going to a meeting with teachers in Wick, where I was saying single plan, single process, and they said, well, Mr. Alexander, this is fine, but why have I got all these other meetings in my diary then? And I said, because you've put them there. Take them out. You shouldn't have them. As well as introducing the new, you've got to get rid of the old. I can't take it out your diary. You have the permission. Stop it. Stop it now. And that was very difficult. Now, you're probably going to come to the coordinated support plan, so just move on to that straight away. The advice we had straight from the start was that you can include the coordinated support plan within the single plan. There are only some elements within the statutory guidance that are absolutely critical that you need to make sure that you have within your plan. So version 1 had that, and our coordinated support plan was embedded in the plan. The way it now works is it's modular, and there's both a page for the individualised education plan, and if children also need the coordinated support plan, the additional demographic detail is on there. It works, it's fine. I know, because I've talked to families and I've talked to colleagues up and down Scotland, that people still struggle with the different legislation in the ASL Act and the particular requirements there. And I know there are worries that when it goes to tribunals, there will be difficulties and there will be conflict. And that might be right, because it looks like currently we've got 2 different sets of legislation. I also know that parents want to be reassured. I'll tell you what, before we rolled out Getting It Right for Every Child, there were 250 children in Highland with education plans. There are now 1,200. They've got 1,200 of these. There were 250 of the old model, and that included CSPs. We now have 1,200. We actually believe we should have 1,500. There are still some children in Highland schools getting additional support for their learning without a plan. That shouldn't be happening, but we're up to about 70%, and we want to get to 100%. But that's 1,200 plans, new version, as opposed to 250 education plans, old world.
You've certainly picked up my next question. What about the looked after child plan? Is that all incorporated there?
That's the plan. If you're a looked after child, then this will be quite a complex document prepared by a lead professional who will be a social worker. If you need a little bit of additional support in school, it will be thin, it will be very proportionate, and it will be prepared by the named person within the school. But it's the same format. What happens is, when you're assessed first time with a health visitor, you're assessed with the single assessment. And that assessment goes with you and builds throughout life. We never move away from the 3 sides of the My World Triangle. Every single practitioner uses the same assessment framework. Some practitioners are specialists. If you're a psychologist, if you're a psychiatrist, you'll do additional specialist assessment. But that's the core assessment for every child.
Now, you've clearly achieved all this without the need for any legislation or anything to do it. Do you think the bill would benefit from any anything further to ensure or to encourage integration between the different plans, or do you think it's there already?
I mean, there are a couple of things we think in the bill around getting it right that are not entirely helpful, and we haven't managed to make named person after school leaving age work, and neither are we convinced that it's desirable. And there are a couple of elements that we suggested should be in there. One is the assessment framework, but frankly that I don't think does need to be statutory. But the second one was lead professional. Named person is absolutely critical, but named person doesn't deal with your more complex and vulnerable children. That has to be a lead professional. In terms of the getting it right guidance, the named person would support early interventions, but as soon as there was more than one agency involved, it becomes a lead professional. So a lead professional coordinates services delivered by more than one agency. And the more complex needs, so children who are looked after, children with significant health needs, children in the Child Protection Register, would always be a lead professional. We also contract with some third sector partners to deliver lead professional for us. So, for example, through care services, going back to an earlier point, we use Bernardo's because it doesn't work with a social worker. And some social workers still wear suits and ties being a lead professional for a 17, 18-year-old who's left care. It's much better a third sector agency. We are told that the drafting of lead professional, because it's multi-agency and it's more complex, is more difficult, and also that named person is more important. I agree entirely with that. I also think that if we're legislating for the child's plan, why can't we legislate for the lead professional that prepares the more complex child's plans? And if we have challenges, one of our 2 or 3 particular challenges is that threshold when the named person becomes a lead professional. So, for example, can I just talk you through this? If you're a head teacher in a school and you're the named person, you can call on a social work resource and you'll get that. And the social work manager cannot say no because you're the named person. But if that social work resource goes in and actually you discover it's more difficult, it's more complex, it's worse than we thought, this is going to take a bit more work, then you might need to pass on that responsibility to a social worker. Now that transfer point, we've got various mechanisms in place to check that a head teacher in the school is not getting involved in stuff that really isn't the business of a teacher and would go much beyond what you'd expect that person to expect. We've got various mechanisms. Without also legislating for the lead professional, we need to make sure the named person doesn't stay involved for too long.
I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about the piece that you said didn't work in relation to named person. I think that was the older children, wasn't it, or older young people. I'm just trying to remember back to what you said. You said there was a piece of the named person.
You said post-school.
Post-school,
Post-school,
yeah.
yes. Well, my daughter's 17, she's doing performing arts in Manchester. How can she have a named person? I don't really understand. She doesn't need one, she doesn't want one. There are young people who are in the system, and we have proportionate ways for managing through the system. So someone with an activity agreement has an activity coordinator. If you're a looked after child who's left care, you've got a lead professional through Bernardo's, and you still have a multi-agency plan. But I don't understand for most children who've left school why we would need a named person, and also I don't think they want such. And I think Ken Norrie said some similar points to you.
Do you think there's a certain proportion of young people would benefit from a named person
Yes.
for a longer period?
Yes.
And do you identify them?
Yes. Well, we endeavour to. So yes, there are young people who leave school who still need additional support. Now, many of those will continue to have social workers. They'll pass from a children's social worker to adult social worker. Some might be supported in youth work. I mean, increasingly, youth work focuses around vulnerable groups as well as universal services. And we have a process whereby youth workers will support certain groups of young people in certain communities. So yes, there should be a range of young people who still need that sort of support post-school. I'm not sure it's a workable universal solution.
Jane Baxter.
Hello. I'd like to first thank you for your submission and the piece in it about the role of the named person. It's very simply written, and I found it very easy to understand. It actually informed my understanding of what this role was going to be. So thank you for that. I've got one or two questions just following on from that. Firstly, do you think that the named person will really be able to know the family well if they're a health visitor with a heavy caseload, head teacher of a large school, or a council official in the school holidays? Do you think that those resource implications are going to make the role a bit weaker?
Okay, I didn't ever get to answer the second bit of Mr MacArthur's question, which is the resource issue for sustaining the model. I think there are two bits to that. Well, let's start with, we'd all like more resources, wouldn't we? And there are always people that will take any opportunity to say, let's get more resources. And we all do that. I do that every opportunity I get. That shouldn't stop us doing things that are right anyway. We do GERFEC, right? We're not asking for resources, we do it. And we're doing it with the resources that we've got. Albeit, yes, we also are trying to recycle resources into preventative resources, because you can invest all of your money in those children with high-level needs, and we should, but investing in those children won't stop more children getting those high-level needs. So we should always invest in more. Now, the named person is the day job. The named person is what the health visitor does when she does her assessments. It's what the school is doing when they do their examinations and assessments and reports home. They are doing named person. That is the role. It's what the school does when it picks up the phone to a social worker and says, can we just talk this through? That is the named person. That is all the day job. You wouldn't say that schools shouldn't do that. Highland schools, Scottish schools have always done that. There is a second issue, which is, do we have enough health visitors? Do we have the right staffing in our schools? Well, Highland certainly believes we should have more health visitors. Highland Council has had responsibility for health visiting since April of last year, and I was delighted when one of the early decisions it made on the back of the Early Years Collaborative was to invest an additional £2 million in those services. And that's important. That will enhance what we can do in terms of our services for children. It isn't about the named person. It's just that we think that's a valuable service and it will make a significant difference. But this argument that somehow it's possible to get by without a structured practice model, with lots of meetings, with half a dozen different plans, without knowing what the person in the next office, never mind the next service, is actually doing with the same child. Somehow that's more resource effective than having a structured model where there's clarity about who has responsibility, where there's clarity about where information goes, and where there's a single plan. And if you need a meeting, because frankly, we took half the meetings out of the diaries, if you need a meeting, you only do it once, and you don't repeat it next week with another bunch of people. How the advantage is on the ad hoc and chaotic system over the structured and rational system in terms of resource allocation, I don't know. I will always argue for more resources. My actual job is to use the resources I've got as effectively and efficiently as I can. And that's what the practice model gives me. I heard one contributor say that in Highland we've reduced management times in schools. Yes, we have. That's very regrettable. But we do GERFEC. We do GERFEC, although we have less management times in schools, and thank God, because if we're still doing it the way we used to do it, I think we might have gone under.
Thank you. There'll be times when a named person is picking up on concerns that are critical of parents. How have parents in Highland reacted when the named person is collating and passing on information that questions parents' actions or capacities?
There are certainly some courageous conversations that are now happening that probably didn't used to happen. And certainly that has been challenging for teachers. Unless that concern was about possible significant harm, you would always want to discuss that with the family. But yeah, that is difficult, and it's particularly difficult in some of our smaller communities where people do know each other. But teachers know that's the job, and teachers know that works. It's also, for them, very helpful in doing the job. I remember a previous minister, Adam Ingram, who asked to come out because he really didn't believe that teachers would welcome named person, and he wanted to go and meet some. So I took him round a few schools. And he said, how are you coping with all this information that you're now getting? And how are you coping with having to talk to the families about these issues? And the teachers looked at him and said, don't be crazy. It's much easier to know than to not know. It's much easier to understand what's going on and be able to respond to it than either not be able to respond or respond and do the same thing. One thing in particular that transformed the situation overnight for teachers was the police concern forms. I mean, teachers in Highland, like teachers elsewhere in Scotland, often say to me that things happen on a Monday morning that are just out of control and they can't predict because children have been at home for the weekend and back in the communities. Wednesday or Thursday or Friday is pretty predictable. A Monday, you're picking up whatever's gone on in the family and whatever's gone on in the community at the weekend. Now, we've had suicide attempts. We've had serious violence. We've had all sorts of things go on, and the teacher has had to work in ignorance of that. They now know. On the Monday, if there's been a significant situation for that family over the weekend and the child has had a traumatic experience, the school know. They also then can take the decision about, is this something they should discuss with the family, or is it something actually that can be left, or is it, in fact, a significant harm issue on the basis of something else they know, and it should be passed on. And they're able to make that judgment, and they are much happier having that information and being able to make that judgment.
Thanks. Do you think that acting as a named person and being a point of contact, do you think that's having an influence in this changing the day job of people who've got that named person role? Because the bill requires named persons to support and advise and help children and families, so that's a bit more than just being a point of contact. Do you think that this changing role is influencing the day job?
What teachers, health visitors, midwives tell me is it doesn't change what they do. It changes how they're regarded. And I think that goes back to how this developed, because we had Child's Plan and we had lead professional and we had super social workers. But teachers and health visitors said, actually, it's us that know children and families. It's us that talk to the parents. It's us that deal with the basic issues. But what do you call us? And, families said, we don't want a social worker. Do you respect the social workers? We want to go in and talk about this to the child, the teacher who teaches our child in school. But what do you call that? And the phrase named person came up. And the other thing that teachers said is that if we say something to a social worker, we want it to be valued. We're passing that on because we have a relationship with the family and because we've discussed it with the family and we believe it's important. So having the named person role hasn't changed what people do, but they feel it's empowered them. I've used an example quite often of a preschool child. I'll try and say this without breaching any personal circumstances. A preschool child whose behaviour was very challenging. And the parents were distraught and distressed by all of this. And they were doing the phoning round of every agency. My child's not bad. Something else is going on. Please listen. But it was the behaviour. But when they spoke to the health visitor felt empowered to draw on specialists, to draw on clinicians, to draw on people very senior to her and say, no, there's something here. I believe there's a different issue. Now, a hearing impairment was diagnosed and the hearing impairment was addressed. That child doesn't have bad behaviour anymore. And that was the power of the named person.
Convener.
Thank you. Neil.
Yeah, just to sum up, Mr Alexander, what do councils need to do, other than follow the letter of the legislation in terms of implementing GIRFEC, what else is required from local authorities to make sure GIRFEC works and we do get it right for every child?
There are other things we need to crack, and with due respect to all of my colleagues, there are still some colleagues that prefer to work much more autonomously. Specialist clinicians, paediatricians, psychiatrists sometimes, so we haven't yet got the full family around the child. We still need to persevere with that. And GPs would never be named persons, but I think we need to do more work to ensure that GPs fully understand what it's all about and can use the practice model to the greatest benefit of the child and the family. Coming back to the information sharing issue, I think our greatest failure as authorities and agencies, and I have to say as the Scottish Government over the last 10 years, has been our failure to achieve electronic information sharing. Because I have access to an electronic social work system, I can look at the plan at my desk of any child on the Child Protection Register. But a colleague in a different discipline who might need to know what's happening with that child today can't do that. So they'll have the latest plan, they'll have a copy of it, but someone will have had to have gone to the computer, printed it out, stapled it, put it into an envelope and taken it to a post office and posted it. And they can't be quite sure that one they've got in their drawer is actually the latest one. Now that is unsafe, and we really have to address that. And I don't understand, when we all tweet and we all Facebook and we all watch football on our phones, why we can't do that. So there's still much to be done. I think the key components in getting it right are there. I would have liked to have seen the lead professional there. I think that is critical. I think Scotland is now using the assessment framework, but it is important we all do use the assessment framework. But I mean, Scotland's got something here that works and we should be proud of. And I think, you know, what's in the legislation will take us forward significantly.
Thank you very much. Can I thank you very much, Mr Alexander, for that explanation of what's happening in Highland and the Pathfinder project that you've been involved in. And I'm going to spend very briefly while we change panels quickly.
Thank you.
Our second item today is to take evidence on the Scottish Government's 2014-2015 draft budget. The committee has agreed to focus its scrutiny on the Scottish Government's youth employability commitments, funding for these and how the policy focus on younger learners is impacting on lifelong learning. Before I begin the questioning this morning, can I just apologise to the witnesses? It's been a rather long session this morning, but as you'll have seen, we had some very detailed and important evidence that we had to take on the Children and Young People Bill. So once again, I apologise for the delay in starting, and I hope you don't mind. Can I begin, though, by going straight to the questioning with Liam MacArthur?
Obviously, there's been a particular focus on trying to address issues of employability and addressing youth unemployment in particular. But we've seen in a recent Audit Scotland report, perhaps some of the implications of this for older and adult learners. I think, Professor Gallagher, this is a theme you pick up in your written evidence. Could you perhaps indicate what you see as the current trade-offs there, the impacts that this is having on employability generally amongst older and adult learners?
Thank you. Chair, perhaps I should also say just before I start that while I'm here clearly in my capacity as an independent academic, I am also a member of the board of the City of Glasgow College, so perhaps it should be noted for the record, but I am here in my independent capacity today. Yes, thank you for that question. I think that an important role the colleges has had over many, many years is that they provide a very wide range of educational opportunities for the whole, in a sense, post-school population, going up to older learners as well. The impact on the greater emphasis on young people, it's not having a huge impact just now, I don't think, on actual student numbers. And obviously there are very complex ways of trying to measure that, because, as you know, we can look at enrolments or student numbers or full-time equivalents or weighted sums, and you get different answers depending on which you look at. I think, I mean, one of the things that's also quite important here is that there has been a steady move away from part-time provision to a greater emphasis on full-time provision, and that has had quite a significant impact, because many older learners are traditionally part-time learners. And if you look at what's been happening in the college sector over quite a long period of time, there has been a move towards a greater emphasis on full-time provision. And that's associated with the decline in student numbers, because as colleges place more emphasis on full-time students, there are less actual students there. And particularly if you look at higher education provision, that's been quite significant there. Increasingly, higher education provision has moved from being part-time. You know, I think in my paper I quoted some evidence there that part-time HNCs have declined very significantly over quite a long period of time. And increasingly we're looking now at a lot of HN provision being full-time provision, full-time HNDs and also full-time HNCs. So in terms then of in a sense, the sort of role of the colleges of providing part-time work-related education, I think there has been quite significant change in that, and that's something I think that we should be really trying to look at and address, and I've said that in my paper as well. I mean, the area of modern apprenticeships is one that I think is important in that respect. You know, there's a lot of emphasis in the development of advanced apprenticeships, but there's not an awful lot happening in some respects in that area. So I think what we've got is a complex situation where there are a number of different factors that are driving change in the college sector. But I think underlying this, I think we should be looking at this question of how do we try to ensure that there is good quality part-time provision as well as full-time provision for the wider age range.
I mean, the figures you point to, I think, in your evidence suggest, in terms of part-time provision, numbers around 14,800 or so part-time HNC courses back in 2001-2 to a figure for 2011-12 of 5,380. Now, there would be a variety of reasons for that, and obviously the issue in relation to why people take on part-time courses go well beyond employability.
Yes,
From what you're saying, do you see there being potentially a weakness in an overall employability strategy of too dramatic a shift away from those part-time provision, particularly for, I think, as we heard in previous budget processes, female learners and older learners? Would that be an accurate?
Well, I think certainly the college sector as a whole should be very cognizant of those figures, and there should be significant questions being asked about how we begin to ensure that there is more high quality part-time work-based provision than there is at the present time, and we should be looking at ways of trying to address the trend. I mean, those figures you say are only one part of the overall picture, but I think they are significant.
So a focus on full-time course provision, and that's clearly been a stated objective of the Scottish Government. Is there what latitude is there for individual colleges or colleges within the regions taking a view in terms of the provision in individual colleges and across the region that allows them to address potential weaknesses in terms of a shortfall of part-time provision?
Well, I think it relates to the point that I've made here in that final section of my paper that you've drawn attention to, which is I think we need to be asking what is the range of qualifications that we currently have. And is the range of qualifications that we currently have the best ones, the most appropriate ones for the needs of the Scottish economy at the present time? And I think that, for a variety of complex reasons, we have seen the kind of changes that I'm pointing to here, and I think that points to this need to say, how do we begin to address that question and to encourage the college sector, and it will involve cooperation with the Scottish Qualifications Authority, it will involve cooperation with the employers. But I think it's those kinds of questions that we should be addressing. I mean, I was listening to something on the radio, and just recently, but obviously that I've looked at this in greater detail. But I happened to hear this thing on the radio just the other day. There it was about Germany and the strength of the German economy, and the comment that was being made is that a major strength of the German economy is the number of relatively small employers who place a lot of emphasis on apprenticeship training. Now, we don't have enough of that, and I think it's a question of building up a whole set of links, which involves colleges, it involves employers, and also would involve the Scottish Qualifications Authority as well, and SDS as well, so a whole range of different agencies.
I'm very conscious of time, so not that I want to inhibit questions or indeed answers, but we have to really try and be as snappy as possible. Joan, did you have a very, very quick supplementary?
Very, very quickly. It was actually in terms of Professor Gallagher's written submission, and you very helpfully look at the age profiles of students in colleges from 2009-10 to 2011-12, and looking at the different groups, as you rightly say, the 16 to 24-year-old age group does go up. What's interesting is that 25 to 59, those kind of lifelong learners that we might be talking about, it stays exactly the same. And the only group that's seen a significant fall is 60 and over, which is people of retirement age. So I just wondered, given that the cake's only so big, we're living off a fixed grant in the Scottish Government, if you had to set priorities, would you say that perhaps priority in terms of training young people and maintaining the training for people of employment age is probably correct, and that if you have to cut back, you don't want to cut back in anything, but if you have to cut back on something, perhaps courses for people who are retired might be the one that has to go?
Well, as you say, we're faced with difficult choices in anything here. One of the things I think it's important to bear in mind is the role of the colleges in providing a wide range of educational opportunities, and in that respect, I think the colleges have been extremely good at providing opportunities for adult learners to come back into the system. Now, as you say, if those figures here, the 25 to 59 age group on those figures has remained relatively stable, and I think that's something that's very good. Actually, if you look at the figures slightly differently, as I say, I've quoted there the number of enrolments. If you looked at it in terms of FTEs, you would actually get a rather different picture, and you would see that young people are a much higher percentage of the FTEs in the college. So you do get quite a different picture there if you look at FTEs. The picture really actually turns round. Now, there hasn't been a marked decline in the 25 to 59 age group, I think, no matter how one looks at it, which is very good, I think. But I think what is important is that that at a time of very significant change in the economy of the society, while trying to provide opportunities for young people, as you say, is a priority, we do not lose sight of the fact that it's important that there are opportunities for adult students to return to education and to gain opportunities. And I think in the past, we've probably talked about the idea that colleges have been particularly important in that respect for women returners. And many women returners, this has been the way that they have got back into the system. So, I think that on one level it is good that there doesn't seem to be a marked decline here, but I think we've got to be very conscious of the fact that as time moves on, and remember, the impact of changes in the budget are going to continue to be quite significant over quite a period of time, because of the projected savings that are going to be associated with regionalisation. There will be continuing staff cuts within the college sector, and we've got to be conscious in that situation that we don't begin to significantly skew the role that the colleges have.
Thank you. Liz Smith.
Professor Gallagher, can I just ask one very quick question? You mentioned in your evidence about the reclassification of colleges and the implications for reserves. Could you tell us about the discussions that you've had with the Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council since 2010 and now, and what stage you're at in that?
With regard to ONS in particular?
Because it was flagged up in 2010 and obviously it happens next year. Could you just tell us what stage you're at in discussions about this issue?
Obviously it's a much wider thing. It's not for me particularly, it's for the whole college sector. I mean, and colleagues in the college sector are much more fully involved. The crucial thing now is the thing that I think I've referred to here. One of the crucial things is the implication for college reserves, where many colleges have very significant reserves and continue to generate significant surplus income at the end of each year. And the crucial question will be how those reserves can be safeguarded. The current issue, as you're probably aware, is that there will be, in a sense, arm's length trusts will be established, and the existing reserves will be transferred into these trusts, and new additional income will be transferred into them. But obviously, one of the issues for the colleges here is the colleges will lose control of those trusts. I mean, once an independent trust is established, it's an independent trust. So the extent to which the colleges will continue to have control over those reserves could become a significant question, and we don't know the answer to that at the present time.
Thank you.
Joan McAlpine.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could comment perhaps across the panel on the complexity of the different employability initiatives and any difficulties that have occurred as a result of those of employability and training being split between the UK and Scottish governments.
Could I begin by asking Ken Wimber to respond to that question?
Yeah. Could I maybe first of all indicate that we've only just recently had our second meeting with Sir Ian Wood, who is looking particularly at the question of the improved employment prospects for our young people. And you'll be aware that his interim report makes particular recommendations about the role of further education in that process. But the second part of his report, which he's going on to look at now, is examining the question of the relationship with employers and how you encourage employers to offer apprenticeships and to link in with colleges and with schools even in order to deliver that improvement. And that is the particular area where I think the complexity you've referred to comes in, because I don't think it's an accident that Serene Wood is having to, has made recommendations with regard to FE at this stage, but is having to take a little bit longer time looking at how you actually get the encouragement for the employers to take, to be part of the process and to encourage the uptake of modern apprenticeships particularly.
Would anybody else like to comment? You don't have to, but...
I actually believe, I actually work in a college as well as being the Vice Chair of the Unison FE Committee. I believe you're asking people to start monitoring student progress once they've left the college going on to employment. And I believe with the funding cuts that we've had, that is a very difficult task for the colleges to do. We do see some monitoring of students from the SDS funding. When they leave, we do have to monitor how they progress, and we do receive monetary funding for doing that task. But if you're asking colleges to do that in a normal environment, I don't believe we have the staffing, the support staffing, to be able to do that. I also believe that there's very little interaction between colleges and small employers. We do see the contracts for the power lines, the contracts for green energy, the wind turbines. We work closely with those sorts of people, but the smaller people don't have time to work with us. To help us with our education and educating students how the employers wish.
Gordon?
I think I'm reluctant to preempt what will come out of the Wood report. But I think Ken's point about how we encourage apprenticeships, and I think one of the things we're interested in is how you look at the kind of quality in apprenticeships, and there's no real equivalent of a kind of quality assurance process there, and I think that's an important point for us to look at. But I think without I think waiting until the Wood Commission report is finished is.
Thank you, Jim.
I would again like to kind of echo in some measure what Ken has said. That I think that the Wood report is providing us with a very valuable opportunity to address these questions. I think some of the issues that have already emerged in the interim report, I think, are extremely important in saying that we need to think. It goes back to my response to Mr MacArthur's questions. We need to think much more carefully in Scotland about how we are addressing issues to do with vocational education and training. I've also made reference in my submission to the opportunities associated with the senior phase of the Curriculum for Excellence, which again is noted in the interim report from Serene Wood. And I think again there are big opportunities here, but we've got to really be very focused, I think, on these questions for the future.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. The panel may be aware that the committee has done some work on educational attainment and also the outcomes for looked after children. And in that context, do you think that the current range of employability initiatives adequately address concerns about reaching harder to reach groups, I suppose, who would previously be described as NEETs in society?
Ken?
It echoes what I said earlier in relation to Woods to a certain extent, but it does seem to me that one of the outcomes of the difficult financial position that FE has been in is that the school-college partnership programmes, which have been on the go for some considerable time, have diminished to a certain extent. And I think that it's important that, I hesitate to mention his name again, but the Woods interim report does indicate that he wants to see a reinvigoration of the school-college partnership, which I think would directly relate to the kind of youngster that you're referring to, and would directly improve the kind of service which could be provided for that particular group.
Can I just say briefly? I mean, this is an issue that the Funding Council, as you're probably aware, has focused on over recent years. And I think it's important that there should be continuing recognition of this and continuing support for it.
I think one of the issues in terms of care leavers is the support that's available to them during education. We know kind of anecdotally, for example, that there is funding available for students who've left care in higher education, but that the take-up of that is much below even the kind of abysmally low numbers of care leavers that do make it into higher education. And I think there are particular challenges for us around how we increase take-up of that. And you know, there are questions around the kind of stigma attached to that and the understanding in institutions of the particular challenges that care leavers face, for example, in terms of accommodation and where they go during the summer holiday or the Christmas break. But there's a lot of work still to be done around that, and I think it's a really important one, and I think it's right that focus is put on it.
I think the other problem that we've got as well is with the merged colleges for these sorts of students. When we're going to stop running certain courses at certain colleges, and so we're going to have these students having to travel an awful long way, you know, to get to perhaps the course that they want to go to. You know, we've got problems with young men who face a fear of violence when travelling away from their own communities. We've got young people who lack the confidence to take up education. If it's in their own communities, then maybe they will take that up. But if we're actually asking them to travel 20, 30 miles to another community, you know, they may not. Another area is tiredness. You know, we're asking these children to travel sometimes up to 75 miles. And you know, they get up at 5:30 in the morning and they're not getting back home till 8 at night. That is very difficult for a young person, and especially a young person who is a looked after young person. They can't cope with that sort of thing. They haven't seen that in their lives. I think we need to start, you know, teaching these people in their own communities. We need to have the courses available to them within, you know, their own little community. Otherwise, I think we're going to deprive them of further education.
A number of initiatives already out there where colleges have outreach services in particular communities.
Yes, but they're being cut. For my own example, we had, I work at Stranraer, which is a remote college. We had another resource at Newton Stewart. That's been cut. That campus has been cut. So yes, there is, but we haven't got the funding now to be able to have the outreach services that we used to have. So it's becoming more and more difficult.
Okay. Can I just say something?
Briefly, yes.
I think there is a good point there. I mean, I don't think regionalisation in itself is a problem, but I think that community-based provision is a soft area. And you know, I've done quite a lot of research in the role of community-based education in the college sector, which is extremely important in providing opportunities. But it is a soft area, and there is a danger when colleges are looking for cuts that this is an area that is a soft one.
Thank you. Colin.
Thank you. Skills Development Scotland, they're responsible for quite a range of initiatives, and their funding comes from SFC budget allocations. And, you know, they're involved in employability initiatives and all sorts of things. How successful has SDS been at delivering college-based employability initiatives?
The Get Ready for Work initiative did work quite well. They've obviously stopped that funding now and they're moving on to a new type of funding, and obviously that's only just started up, so we can't really say how well that's going to work. I do believe, going back to the Get Ready for Work experience, they actually went into, like an apprenticeship, they went into companies, worked in companies and did very little work actually in college. The college did the employability skills, writing the CVs, etc., etc. But they also had the experience of work by going out into the workplace. I believe the new funding is more college-based, and I'm not too sure how that will work. Only time will tell with that. But I do think the SDS funding, some of it does work very well.
Some of it?
Yes. I think colleges also do a very good job, and I think because of the budget cuts, maybe it would be more wisely spent with the further education colleges.
Kim.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, that's a very big question, but I think the crucial set of issues here go back to something we've said several times already, which is how are we going to move forward in this area of vocational education and training. And we've made several references already to the report that's been produced by Sir Ian Wood's group. And I think that what we've got to look to in the future is how we get these various organisations, SDS being one, the colleges and the other significant stakeholders, to work together to provide a better quality vocationally based education. I think quite a lot of it that hasn't been sufficiently good just now. There hasn't been sufficient joined up thinking, and so that there is a real need, I think, to look very critically at that question.
Thank you very much, Neil Bibby.
Thanks. If 1,200 staff have already left colleges, how can the regionalisation agenda make the expected savings of £50 million each year? Can the further education sector absorb further teaching losses, and what do you feel the impact on teaching numbers will be in the coming year or years?
Ken.
First of all, can I say that in terms of the regionalisation agenda, we support the principle of moving towards a more coherent strategic overview of the delivery of further education, as opposed to the atomised system we had through incorporation. That's the first thing. It's unfortunate that that process of change which is underway at the moment is coinciding with a period of significant cutback in resource. And that, I think, is a key issue. And the 12 to 1,300 staff that have gone, I think, are split roughly evenly between teaching staff and support staff. So it goes across the board. And I think there's an assumption here that the savings which will come from rationalisation in 2015, perhaps 2016, are not the savings which we are talking about now, because these savings are being imposed from the centre. And I think there's an assumption that any savings which come from rationalisation will in some way leave the service. And it seems to me it's important that if there are savings which come from the restructuring of FE across the country, then those savings should be reinvested in the service to deliver the kind of things that the Woods report is hopefully going to recommend. If we don't do that, then I think we're missing a trick with regard to the delivery of particularly vocational education at a time when supposedly the economy is on the up.
Tim?
I think that, again, as Ken has said, I think there is quite a lot of scope for constructive restructuring of the college sector. We have a college sector that was developed many years ago for a different era, and there is a real opportunity, I think, for significant restructuring and to make the colleges much more focused and to address the kind of questions that we're talking about. However, I think that, as I've said in my own submission, I think one of the real dangers that we've got to bear in mind here is that a lot of the savings do involve staff reductions. And if voluntary severance schemes are implemented, we've got to be very careful about how they're implemented and their impact. And there's a real danger that we can lose key staff in key areas, and we can significantly weaken the college structure in that process. So there's a very careful set of questions that have got to be asked, which is in seeking to implement this rationalisation, how do we ensure that we maintain the key roles that we expect the colleges to have and to actually get better at doing. And it does relate also back to some of our earlier questions about the impact on the wider adult community. There's a danger that that the colleges could become skewed, and we've talked about the role of community-based provision as well. So I think on the one hand there are very positive opportunities associated with regionalisation and with rationalisation, but we've also got to recognise that there are potentially significant costs and significant dangers, and those should be kept very firmly in view when we're looking at the impact.
Thank you. Neil, do you want to follow up? Or are you?
Just, well, if I can, yeah, just obviously in terms of the number of staff, we've seen a reduction, and full-time equivalent students may have stayed the same, but headcount figures obviously been reduced. Can I ask, what is the long-term impact, do you think, of fewer staff and students in further education, in general terms, but also the effect that I'll have on the economy?
Can I start with Shirley?
It's actually having a huge impact. I don't know whether you've read some of the press reports just recently in the paper. We've got Coatridge College who already have a £430,000 shortfall in their childcare budget. We've got other colleges reporting that they're unable to cope with the demand for bursaries and childcare. The effects this is having on staff, because of the cuts, we've got reduced staff numbers, so they're unable to cope, with all these demands on them. We've got one college reporting that it's only completed 25% of its applications this year. They don't believe that they'll have them completed by the end of October. That's 9 weeks into the term, and we've got students with no money. The councils aren't providing their money for rent because they believe they're going to get bursaries for that. These students haven't got any money to pay the rent. They face being evicted. They haven't got money for food. Frontline staff actually see the effects this is having on the students. That's causing them stress and upset. They know that they can't cope with the workload. We've got another college with 2,000 unanswered emails waiting to be answered, and a lot of it on funding. There's the hardship grants. A lot of them are being withheld because they don't believe we're going to have enough money for bursaries and for childcare, so they're not using the discretionary funds. They're saving that just in case they need to top up bursary and childcare. It's a bit of a mess just at the minute out there.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm conscious of time. I'm just trying to make sure everybody gets a chance to answer, and we've still got members want to ask questions. Gordon, did you want to add anything to that, or has it been covered?
I think that covers it. And I think there are obviously big challenges in terms of regionalisation. It's something, like Ken said, we support in principle, and it's unfortunate that it's happening at a time of tight budgets. But I think, as Shirley was saying, that there have been lots of stories we've heard of for example, students' applications not being processed in time for them to receive their SAS loans, and it's not clear whether that's an issue in terms of the reorganisation of the colleges and kind of processes not being put in place. We suspect that it's perhaps a kind of capacity issue, and as Ken was saying, a lot of the staff that have left are not just teaching staff, they're administrative staff. And these are people who are performing absolutely crucial roles. And one of the big challenges we have is the money we put into colleges there's a sense in which it's wasted if the student support isn't there for the students, and they have to leave the course before finishing it, or they're not able to continue in their studies. And it appears that may be the case in some instances.
Thank you. Sorry for that, Gordon. Thank you very much. A final question from George Adam.
Yes, I'd just like to talk about some of the positive aspects in colleges. It's my nature, I can't help myself. But the funding last year, when it was announced at 521.7 million for 2014 and 526 for 2015-16, it was welcomed by most of the organisations in the sector. In particular, Colleges Scotland said it was the resource they needed to continue with the work that was in hand. But One of the things that we're focusing on, the government's focusing on younger people, ensuring that they've got a future and using colleges that way. Now, surely that's a good thing. Surely we're making sure that we don't have something like from the past where we had almost like the dark days of Thatcherism with a lost generation. Surely we're actually, the government's policy pushing that forward is a positive. And also the fact that the Scottish Government's funded for 116,000 full-time equivalent places in 2011-12, but they actually ended up with 119,448 full-time equivalents. So surely that's all good news. Surely we're moving in the right direction with that.
Very conscious of time, and I apologise, but could we have very quick answers along the panel? Jim.
Well, I think, you know, yes, there are very useful things there. I think in relation to the question of providing education for young people, I think one of the crucial things is what kind of education is it they're getting? And this goes back to my earlier point about we've got to make sure we've got the right qualification structure in place. It isn't enough just to bring people into college. We've got to ensure that when they're in the college, they're getting a high quality of educational experience. And I think that is a crucial question that we should all be focusing on very, very carefully.
Thank you. Gordon?
I kind of broadly agree. I think there are clearly good things happening, and I think it would be a shame if other factors meant that those opportunities weren't available to students and young people. And I think the point about student support is an important one, that if students are being pushed into payday lenders or into commercial debt, or they're being pushed out of their studies entirely for the sake of relatively small amounts of money to give them adequate student support, and they're not able to kind of take up these opportunities, then that would be a huge shame.
You've actually increased our weighted sums targets this year for all colleges to reach. And in order for the colleges to do that, they're actually increasing the class sizes. I don't actually believe that gives the child a better education. I talked to a lecturer recently who has been in the college for many years, and she used to teach for 27 hours one class. That class now is being taught for 15 hours a week with 1 hour self-study. There is no way they can give them the education and the qualifications that they used to have with such a reduced number of hours. And the only way we can, you know, teach the numbers that we're asking to be taught with the weighted sums target is by not delivering as good an education. And that isn't down to the lecturer. The lecturers try as much as they can. It's not down to the support staff who are trying to support them. It's because we do not have the resources to actually teach those children as we should be teaching them.
Ken.
Unlike yourself, I'm a born pessimist, although I'm seldom
Will you balance
disappointed.
each other up then, Ken?
I'm seldom disappointed. Could I just make the point about funding in FEs, and certainly on the basis of what had gone before, the 2013, 14, 15 budgets are an improvement. But to put it in context, the sector has lost £30 million since 2011. That's just under a 6% cut in money terms for the sector. That doesn't take into account inflation. And it seems to me that, bearing in mind what we face, restructuring, the desire to grab hold of any signs of recovery, and particularly any signs of increased employment in the economy, it does seem that FE has an important role, and that important role will not be fulfilled with the kind of financial regime that it's facing at the moment.
Can I thank you all very much? Can I firstly, yet again, apologise for the rather squeezed time we had today? And also can I apologise because when I was busy apologising at the start for the squeezed time and the lateness of the start, I forgot to mention your names. So can I just say, can I thank very much Professor Jim Callagher, Ken Wimber from the EIS, Shirley Sefton from Unison, and Gordon Maloney from the National Union of Students Scotland. Thank you very much for coming along and giving us your evidence today, and I close the meeting.